So, you've probably heard of Aileen Wuornos, perhaps America's most infamous female serial killer. The media paints her story with broad strokes of terror and of tragedy.
If it was a horrendous crime, why didn't I shoot them between the eyes, cut their penis off, stick it in their mouth? All they were was shot.
But the true depth of her tale remains shrouded in mystery. Was she a victim of circumstance, a predator by choice, or a blend of both, fighting back against a world that never showed her kindness?
If I was to leave this planet, it wouldn't be no big deal to me, because this is a wicked, wicked world.
Today, we're going to dive into the chilling reality behind the legend, dissecting the motives and the madness that drove her to claim the lives of at least 7 men. Forget what you've seen in the movies, because the true story of Aileen Wuornos begins now.
You have to kill Aileen Wuornos because she'll kill again.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist with me, your host Simon, as always. Well, this is a long one, by the way, so settle in. You can probably see how long it's running for. I don't know if it's going to be a 3-hour one, but I feel like it's 52 pages long, and it's from David, and David always uses small point text stuff to zoom in a little bit. We're going to be here for a while. Settle in. It's probably going to be the large part of my day recording this. So join me as we explore Aileen Wuornos, America's most infamous female serial killer.
I didn't kill him every day, did I?
Definitely familiar with this one. This one's super famous and dark. And, well, if you're new here, welcome to the show. The format is I've never read this before, but I'm vaguely familiar with this story. David's written it for me. I'm going to read it. You and I, dear audience member, are going to explore it together, so let's jump in. While searching through the vast and tawdry annals of modern American true crime, one may chance upon that rarest and most curious of all figures, the female serial killer. I feel like I should be reading this like David Attenborough. One may chance upon that rarest and most curious of all figures, the female serial killer. That's a pretty shitty David Attenborough impression, but you know what I'm getting at, right?
Very well.
One such figure is Aileen Wuornos. One such figure is Aileen Wuornos, the rage-filled alcoholic and roadside sex worker who, between 1989 and 1990, killed at least 7 men in Florida while police grasped in vain for a suspect. I don't want to feel like... Why does my brain default to, like, every casual criminalist is always like,
oh yeah, man kills sex worker.
And in this one, sex worker kills man. It's like, yes. It's like, wait, that's not good. That's not good. That's still bad.
It's called revenge.
Aside from being depicted by Charlize Theron in the highly inaccurate 2003 movie Monster, the story of the real Aileen Wuornos is still largely unknown. To this day, the enduring mystery of her case is why she committed her crimes. Was she a traumatized victim acting in self-defense? Was she a highway thief and cold-blooded killer? Or was she a madwoman, unleashing her violent anger upon men who had done her no harm? We shall explore this mystery and more on this episode of The Casual Criminalist. Nice little introduction there.
Thank you, I tried.
It's 6:10 p.m. on November the 30th, 1989, in the town of Clearwater on the western coast of Florida. 51-year-old Richard Mallory was just closing up his electronics store for the night. Mallory told his young employee, Jeff Davis, that he was heading out on a service call, presumably to repair someone's television or VCR. Mallory walked out with a black briefcase that he always had with him, stuffed with cash. He did not take one of the 2 company vans he used for the electronics store. Instead, he took his personal vehicle, a beige 1977 Cadillac Coupe de Ville. A veterinarian who worked nearby saw him go. One more thing is worth mentioning. The story that he told Jeff Davis about the repair call was a lie. No. David, I figured that out. I was like, he's definitely going to go and see a sex worker, isn't he? That's where he's off to. Richard Mallory was 5'11", 170 pounds. I'm 5'11".
I'm trying to tell a story here.
I heard recently, I'm like 5'11 and a half. I heard recently, no one's ever 5'11. And so from now on, I'm just going to refer to myself as being 6 foot tall. 170 pounds. He occasionally wore glasses, had a small, close-cropped moustache, typical of the late 1980s, and had a bit of a comb over to mask his slightly receding hairline. Oh, what was his name? Oh, Jeff. No, Jeff was the young employee. Mallory. Richard. Oh, Dick, at some point, you've just got to embrace it. You got to shave off the head. Well, I'm saying this like he's got a future, but I get the feeling he's about to be murdered. Simon, why are you making jokes? It's not appropriate.
Today's video is sponsored by Vessi, and yes, I am wearing their coat right now. It's extremely comfortable. It's extremely warm. It is the perfect coat. And you know what else is perfect? What they're best known for, and that is absolutely their shoes, which are waterproof but somehow breathable at the same time. I've been wearing Vessis for years. Vessi first started sponsoring me 2, maybe 3 years ago now, and I've literally worn nothing else. I'm not wearing shoes right now because I'm inside and my feet are, you know, not outside. So I'm not wearing Vessis right now. But if I was to go outside, I'd only be wearing Vessis. This time of year, it's these Ultra boots. It's, did I mention it's really cold outside? It's -12 today, which is just unreasonably cold. And these keep my feet warm. They're the Ultra boots. They're waterproof, basically up to here. So, and it's not water resistant, it's waterproof. They use something called Dymatex. And I love these things. Plus fantastic grip on the bottom. And also they look big and chunky and heavy, but they're not heavy. They're surprisingly lightweight. Also, if you're needing something a little less heavy than the Ultra, go for the Soho. It's got this like beautiful leather material. It's not leather though. It's vegan, eco-friendly. These are fantastic as well. They're called the Soho. Plus, there's the jacket. It's called the Overcast. It's 100% waterproof. It's got a relaxed fit. It's got an adjustable hood. What more can you need? Plus, they've got these gloves. These are fantastic. Actually, just got these the other day. And like I said, it's -12. So these are going to be keeping me warm. Also, the tips, you can use your phone with them. So that's nice. So go to vessi.com/TCC and pick yourself up a pair of Vessi shoes or the gloves or the jacket, whatever you want. vessi.com/TCC for 15% off. Free shipping to Canada, US, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore. Thanks to Vessi for sponsoring, and now back to today's video.
Despite only being 51 years old, Mallory already had his teeth pulled out and was fitted with a set of dentures. He had owned the electronics shop in Clearwater for several years. He claimed to have been married and divorced 5 times and had a son that he never saw. Richard, your life sounds a bit messy, to be honest. And what happened to your teeth? For the past 18 months, Mallory had been dating a woman named Jackie Davis, mother of his employee Jeff. It was purely because Mallory and Jackie had been dating that Jeff had got the job. Mallory had also been cheating on Jackie with a woman named Nancy, whom I wonder why you got divorced so many times. Whom he had met via a matchmaking business. But Nancy had dumped him once she found out Richard Mallory was already in a relationship. A few days prior, on November the 26th, Jackie Davis had already broken up with Mallory, citing his alcoholism, drug use, sex, and pornography addiction, and his tendency to disappear for days at a time on benders. And again, I repeat, I wonder why his relationship, I wonder why he's been divorced 5 times. If I disappeared for days, my wife would be like, what the like, that would be the idea would be insane to me. I'd be like, oh, maybe I'm like whoosh, but if I go out with my mates, I'm always like, if I'm going to be back after 10:30, I'll let you know, because I don't want her to worry about me. And I'd do the same for her. I'd be like,
Please let me know.
and I always, like, when she goes out, I always wait up because I'm like, I'm just worried, you know?
He's so adorable, like a little doll.
If I went away for days at a time, it'd be like, what the is up with you? Indeed, Richard Mallory had a rap sheet of several drunk driving offences. His apartment contained a large collection of pornographic videotapes and nude magazines, as well as Polaroid pictures he'd taken of various women for his personal collection. He also had an assortment of telephone numbers from women he had met via dating services, and still more numbers from strippers and call girls. Mallory regularly visited strip clubs in Clearwater and other towns in Florida. In approximately 24 such strip clubs, he was known by name to the dancers and the bar staff. Mallory always showed up with a roll of cash, drank a lot, tipped well, paid for lap dances, and often tried to solicit the sexual services of the girls who danced for him. Sometimes the dancers accepted, sometimes they politely declined. I feel this guy's definitely got some sort of addiction going on, right? How do they treat that? Isn't there some pill you can take? Because surely, like, someone who's like super oversexed like this, can't they just do? Because they do that thing. We had a sponsor actually approach us. I won't name them. About some company that do, like, they'll test your testosterone levels, and then if they're low, they'll give you like a little testosterone pill to like get your testosterone up for whatever reason.
They're preparing for war.
And I'm always mega skeptical about medical companies, so I'd like vet the shit out of them. And for this one, my biggest turnoff was like, wait. You're going to diagnose the problem that your business is paid to fix. It just felt like a conflict of interest. And I know, like, obviously you go to the doctor and they'll tell you what's wrong with you and then they'll prescribe you a drug. But this felt like more capitalist. And it's like, wait, you're telling me I've got a problem and then you just happen to have the solution to fix it. Seems a bit weird. But can't they give him some sort of anti-testosterone pill to like make him less like, When they declined, Mallory would offer to pay them handsomely to dance for him in a private location, whereupon he would again propose sex for cash. This is what Mallory had planned to do on the night of November the 30th, hence why he had lied to Jeff, his ex-girlfriend's son. The regular visits to the strip clubs cost money, of course. What? They did? And Mallory's electronics business was not doing well. He owed $3,800 or $9,200 in today's money in overdue rent for the store's location in a strip mall. He was also being audited by the IRS for not paying his taxes. Uh-oh. Mallory. And he's like, let's blow off some steam with expensive hookers. I mean, sex workers, sorry. It's just like, I just got overexcited. Mallory had an interesting business model. Don't pay your rent, don't pay your taxes, boom! By November the 30th, 1989, he had approximately 120 incomplete TV and VCR repair jobs lining the backroom shelves of the store, the oldest dating back to May of that year. Once the customers got angry enough, Mallory would pay a few outside repairmen a single fee to come in and do a bunch of repairs all at once, so he didn't have to pay a repairman a regular salary. But actually, that sounds kind of smart, to be honest. Just stack them all up. Get to the point where they're just... Because, I mean, how often do you need something repaired? Stack them all up, then bring in a guy and be like, whip through as many of those as you can, and then make a tidy profit. It would also appear that Mallory had only hired Jackie Davis' son part-time to keep in her good graces. There was even public and police speculation that the electronics store was just a front, and that Mallory was allegedly involved in the drug trade. Oh, he's got some Breaking Bad shit going on. 6 months earlier, in May 1989, Mallory had bailed out a man named Michael Rosenblum from jail after Rosenblum had been arrested on a cocaine charge. That's a bit weird, isn't it? Rosenblum later claimed to have worked for Mallory in some capacity in the electronics store. They had no personal friendship, neither friends nor family in common, and there was no clear reason why Mallory would pay Rosenblum's bail other than out of kindness as his employer. I'd get the feeling that someone's been like, yo, Rosenblum's been pinched. Go get him. And be like, who's Rosen? Okay, fine. Because like whoever's the main kingpin drug dealer doesn't want to show up at the police and pay bail. Yet immediately after paying his bail, Mallory fired Rosenblum and severed all connection with him. Mallory was also known to be paranoid, changing the locks on his apartment multiple times a year. None of this conclusively proves that Mallory was involved in the roaring coke trade in 1980s Florida, but the Rosenblum connection and Mallory's broken husk for business was with an irregular tax record, and his proclivity for strippers who tended to snort coke by the wagon load were enough to arouse police suspicions at the time. It feels like this guy's just a terrible criminal. It's like, bro, if you're laundering money for like cocaine dealers, maybe you should keep your books in order. Just maybe. Isn't that the point? I've seen Breaking Bad. That's the whole reason they have the car wash, to clean the money. Oh, not literally, obviously. For future reference, it must be stated that in 1958, when Richard Mallory was 20 years old, he was convicted of attempted rape in the state of Maryland. He had broken into a woman's house while she was alone and attacked her. Mallory was sentenced to 8 years in a correctional facility that tried to rehabilitate sex offenders with psychological observation and therapy. That sounds great. That sounds like a really good thing. It's like normally they're just like, oh, you're committed a sexual crime? Get in prison where you're just going to get more like fucked up, right? I like prison, yes, it should be there to punish people, but also if we could fix people, that'd be nice. Like give this guy some pill. Give him the anti-testosterone pill to make him like less the way he is. His doctor noted in 1961 that Richard Mallory, quote, possessed strong sociopathic trends. Oh no, they don't make a pill for that though. When he was released from prison, Mallory would lie to people that had been sentenced for burglary. Probably smart though. It's like, what'd you go to prison for? Tried to rape someone. That's not what you'd say. There was this brilliant TV show. God, it was so good. It was about a kid, or he's like 18 or something. And he got like wrongly convicted of some sexual crime or whatever, or he was like waiting trial for like some sexual crime. And he's like in prison and some guy pretends to be his friend. And he's like, whatever you say, don't say what you're in for. No one says what, just say you robbed a post office in rural Wales or whatever. And so he's like, yeah, someone's like, what are you in for? And he's like, robbed a post office in rural Wales. And then he gets like beaten up or whatever. Apparently that's like the joke. It's the like new fish joke. They just tell them that that's what you say. And then everyone's like, oh, you did something bad, didn't you? After Richard Mallory left the electronics store on the evening of November the 30th, he drove 38 minutes to a strip club called the 2001 Odyssey in the nearby city of Tampa. I feel like, oh God, who directed? Was it Stanley Kubrick who did 2001: A Space Odyssey? I feel like there's a lawsuit waiting to happen there. From there, Mallory telephoned the Davis residence and left Jeff a message on the answering machine telling the boy that he was fired. Jeff Davis later said that he'd expected this since Mallory and his mother had just broken up and he didn't really do much at the store. Thereupon, Mallory began talking to a stripper by the name of Kimberly Guy, whose stage name was Danielle. They met in 1988 when Mallory first came to the club. Mallory had showed up regularly and paid Kimberly about $150 for an evening, or $360 today, in tips and private lap dances. Strippers make a lot of money, right? Multiple times, Mallory asked Kimberly if she had had sex for money. Kimberly told him that she was a lesbian and had a girlfriend. Oh no. She'd had sex with customers before, but this was her polite way of turning men down. On the night of November the 30th, Mallory again proposed they go back to his electronics store in Clearwater, where they could have sex in private. How romantic. Where should we go? Well, ironically for you, I've got a store at a strip mall. Strip mall? Stripper? Get it? Ah! Mallory offered to give her $50 or $120 in money and a free TV and VCR. Wait. You spent like $150 watching her dance, and then you're like, yeah, okay, I'll give you a third of that if we do the nasty together. What's and a free TV? What is this? Kimberly declined the sex, but she said she'd do a few lap dances for him to try and get him off through his pants. Strip clubs are so weird. I don't understand it. I don't understand strip clubs. I'm not going to elaborate too much because it's just not nice. I just don't like it. Mallory then arranged for a second stripper at the club, Chastity Lee Marcus, who had a long rap sheet and had been a lover of a few biker bosses and had a ton of aliases, to come with them for the same deal. They drove back to the electronics store in the late evening, and each girl picked out a TV and a VCR. Kimberly Guy kept hers, Chastity Marcus pawned hers for cash the next day. Mallory and the two strippers drank, smoked some pot, and the two girls gave them a series of lap dances. There is a matter of some dispute between the testimonies of the two strippers as to which girl wound up having sex with Mallory. Either way, after their business was transacted, Mallory drove them both home. Thereapon, Mallory decided to drive 2 hours northeast across the Floridan Peninsula to the party town of Daytona Beach, where he would continue his bender for several more days. Somewhere along the I-4 highway, headed to Daytona, Mallory picked up a female hitchhiker. She was 33 years old, 5'5", and roughly 160 pounds. She was decidedly rough-looking and was wearing the masculine attire of a biker. She had a beer belly, her hair was unkempt, and her complexion was sallow and greasy. She wore no makeup, and her crooked teeth were stained yellow from nicotine. She certainly looked older than 33. Mallory would be forgiven for not realizing that she was a roadside sex worker, since they usually wore skin-tight clothing and had copious slathering of makeup, signaling that why they were beside the road. As it is, this particular woman preferred not to indicate that she was a sex worker at first, but rather just hitch a ride, start a friendly conversation, and then claim poverty and offer sex for cash somewhere along the way. Already having had her in the vehicle, men would succumb to the temptations of easy gratification and accept. This strategy allowed the woman to overcome the deficiencies in her appearance when it came to making small but regular income from sex work. It's kind of clever, isn't it? She made anywhere between $150 and $300 a week, or $360 to $720 a week in today's money. Wow, being a stripper pays really well then. Didn't that woman make $360 in a night? And she was just dancing. As they drove to Daytona, Mallory pulled out a bottle of vodka and 2 tumblers that he always kept in his car. Oh, the past. And offered the woman a drink, which she accepted. Mallory also began smoking pot, but the woman refused when he offered to share. Somewhere along the I-4, Mallory pulled over at a liquor store and bought the woman a 6-pack of beer. They reached the outskirts of Daytona in the early hours of December the 1st. Mallory pulled over so they could drink and talk some more, which they did for several hours, until 5 a.m. Mallory, mate, what is your life? How old was he? You're a middle-aged man who's been married many times, and you're just like, what am I doing? Just gonna drive hours to Daytona, gonna pick up a hitchhiker, we'll get drunk in the car together and we'll talk until 5 a.m. Mallory, what is your life? God damn.
I'm a drifter with nothing to lose.
That's when the woman claimed she needed money to pay her rent. She offered Mallory sex in exchange for a bit of cash. What happened next? Nobody knows for certain, at least nobody who isn't already dead. Roughly 3 hours later, at 3 p.m., a man was walking his dogs along John Anderson Drive in Ormonds Beach, just north of Daytona. There he saw a 1977 beige Cadillac abandoned on a nearby fire trail. The man approached the vehicle and grew suspicious when he found half buried inside the car a discarded wallet, a bunch of business papers, 2 tumblers, half a bottle of vodka, and some condoms. The witness telephoned the police. An officer arrived, and upon running the plates, examining the wallet, and reading the business papers, he discovered that the car belonged to one Richard Mallory, owner of Mallory Electronics in Clearwater, Florida. Police then telephoned Mallory's address to check on his whereabouts, but received no answer. Mallory has been killed. Mallory's case, honestly, I knew Mallory was going to be killed, right at the beginning. And honestly, if this wasn't how Mallory died young, Mallory was going to die young some other way, wasn't he? I feel I'm really harsh to the victim today.
Because he's a man.
I'm really sorry. I know he's been murdered. Oh, God. I feel like, I don't know why, because I'm a man, but it feels easier to do it when it's a man victim, doesn't it? That's not right. That's like sexism in the opposite direction. What the What did you think was going to happen, Mallory? You're living this wild ass life. Up at 5 a.m. getting drunk in your car, Mallory, while driving with a hitchhiker who probably murdered you, allegedly. Mallory's case was filed with the Missing Persons Unit, and given that an abandoned car was hardly a police priority, the matter was rested for a time. Then, 12 days later, on December the 13th, 1989, 3 homeless men were scavenging in the wilderness northwest of Daytona. They were looking for scrap metal or anything else that had been dumped in the woods, which they could sell for cash. I'm renovating a house, and it was unoccupied for many years before I bought it. And there's just anywhere, like there's on the ground floor, all of the like copper has been ripped off from you get these like copper, the green copper, like what's it called, like a windowsill but on the outside, and it's all just been stripped off. So I have to spend a bunch of money replacing it, and it's like, I'm like, what happened to all of this? And the guys running the house reconstruction was like, yeah, I mean, homeless people just steal it and then sell it for scrap. And I'm like, oh, that's great. Thank you, homeless people. How much is copper worth? It's copper. It's not made out of gold or some shit. Walking through a clearing, the men began to detect the sickly sweet stench of rotting flesh. Then they saw a Floridian turkey vulture. Peering underneath the top, but without moving it, the men could make out a man's head and one of his hands. They immediately fled to a nearby gas station and called the police. When the officers arrived, it was already getting dark. The police lifted the tarp and saw the decomposing body of a middle-aged man. Maggots and bloat flies had already set in, and the flesh had already rotted off rotted off his skull. I just ate my breakfast. When the officers turned the body over, the man's lower jaw dislodged and his dentures came spilling out. David, too much detail, mate. Because the body was only a couple of miles from where the car was found, police suspected that the dead man was the missing Richard Mallory. This was later confirmed by the man's fingerprints. The coroner reported that Mallory had been shot 5 times by a .22 caliber pistol. One bullet had gone through his right arm and lodged in his armpit. Another bullet had ripped through his neck. The rest of the gunshots were directly to the man's chest. 2 of the bullets had pierced his left lung, and that's what killed him. His death would have been slow and agonizing, and as he suffocated in his own blood. Look, Richard Mallory had a wild life, but good lord, that's not how you want to go, is it? I guess he seems to have like a pretty good life, like certainly fucking wild, wasn't it? He's like living like he's in college for his whole life. There are 2 conflicting accounts as to what happened to Mallory in the early hours of December the 1st, 1989. The first is from his accused murderer, Aileen Wuornos, who later testified in court that Mallory had turned violent and sadistic during their sexual encounter. At first, Mallory wrapped a cord around Wuornos' neck, choking her, and said, "You're going to do everything I tell you to do, and if you don't, I'll kill you right now, and I'll you after, just like the other I've done. It doesn't matter to me. Your body will still be warm for my huge cock. Do you want to die slow?" I don't believe it. Like, Richard Mallory was a wild man, but there's no indication. Oh, no, he was. He went to the reform thing for the attempted dinner. So there is a section. I was thinking he's like, you know, doing all this, like, you know, cheating and sex workers and all of this stuff, but he doesn't seem violent. And then it's like, no, I remembered he almost went to jail for the attempted thing, right? So maybe, but I still think it's like, it does seem out of character for like him, who just seems to be, if he was like that all the time, the people at the strip club will be like, "No, Richard, you're not allowed in here because we know you're a sexual violent maniac." To which Aileen claims she shook her head. Then Mallory asked, "You're going to listen to everything I've got to say?" To which Aileen nodded. Mallory then instructed Aileen to lie down on the car seat, where he, words I can't say, where he, you know, sexually assaulted her in a bad way and, both ways. At this point, Aileen claimed she was, quote, crying her brains out. Then Mallory took a Vicine bottle containing rubbing alcohol and squirted it into Eileen's rectum, causing an intense burning pain. He did the same to Eileen's... Oh my lord. Okay, so this is not right. Then he says, "You're dead." Aileen quickly reached into the bag on the floor of the car, pulled out a .22 caliber pistol as Mallory was coming toward her. She fired, striking him in the arm, and then continued to fire until he was dead. The jury did not buy Eileen's story. A few factors might have played into this. Her public defender, Trish Jenkins, tried and failed to get the fact that Mallory had been sent to prison for attempted 1958 admitted into evidence. There was no other circumstantial evidence to add credence to Eileen's claim that she was brutally R-worded and tortured and had killed Mallory in self-defense. Furthermore, the state of Florida does not allow a defendant's criminal record to be brought up in court unless it is directly relevant to the trial. I'd say that. If someone's saying like he was sexually violent towards me and he's got a history of sexual violence, that seems like something that is relevant. But the judge ignored this rule, possibly out of pressure to secure a conviction in a high-profile murder case where Wuornos was already reviled by the public. He certainly would have copped public criticism if she'd been acquitted. The judge allowed an ugly catalogue of Aileen's prior criminal record to be discussed in court, which had the effect of further poisoning the jury against her. Wait, so he's like, yeah, your criminal past can come up, but his can't, which seems a bit weird. Trish Jenkins, Aileen's state-appointed lawyer, failed to dispute the judge's breach of protocol. If proper procedure had been followed in the trial and Mallory's history had become known, it is possible that Aileen may have been acquitted on the basis of reasonable doubt. Instead, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of the murder of Richard Mallory and sentenced to death. Good lord. Sentenced to death? I mean, it's just, I don't want to say it's just a murder, but it's like there's no aggravating factor here, is there? The second version of events was also given by Aileen Wuornos years later when she was trying to hasten the speed of her execution. In order to do this, she recanted her claim of self-defense and painted herself as a cold-blooded killer, saying that she deserved to die. That way, her new defense team could no longer pursue any credible appeals against her death sentence, citing the irregularities of the Mallory trial, or gain any more stays of execution against her will. In this version, Aileen testified that she had offered Mallory sex, told him to get naked, but the older man was ashamed of his body and preferred just to unzip his pants. Sometime during the sexual encounter, Aileen reached into her bag, pulled out her .22 caliber pistol. Mallory attempted to stop her, and she shot him through the arm. Wounded but still mobile, Mallory escaped out the driver's door, with Aileen exiting passenger side and running around the front of the car in pursuit. It was there that Aileen shot Mallory a further 4 times, 2 bullets piercing his left lung. Aileen stood there and watched Mallory choking on his own blood for the next 10 or 20 minutes until the man expired. Then Aileen looted the victim's corpse. In this version of events, Aileen claims that her objective had been robbery all along, and that she had killed Mallory in order to leave no witnesses. Aileen testified that she had found only $40 on Mallory, despite the fact that he was known to go on benders with several $100s in order to garner the attention of strippers. Aileen dragged the body into a clearing a few feet away from the car and made a half-hearted attempt to cover it with a tarp and a piece of cardboard. Then Aileen stole Mallory's car and drove away. Around 7 a.m., Aileen arrived back at the rundown Ocean Shores motel where she checked in with her lover, Tyra. Aileen told Tyra that she had come into some money, which in itself implies Aileen found more than $40. It's like, listen, I've got some news. Come into a little bit of money. Ooh, how much about $40? Let's go get dinner. And then that's all the money gone. And her friends had loaned her a car so they could finally move into a new place that morning. They loaded up their possessions and drove to an apartment up the road. Without bothering to unpack, they dropped off their stuff and Aileen drove Tyra back to the Ocean Shores motel so Tyra could collect her moped and drive it to her work shift at the upscale Casa del Mar Hotel at 9 a.m. Meanwhile, Aileen threw a bicycle in the trunk of Richard Mallory's car and drove it to a fire trail off John Anderson Drive in Ormond Beach. There, Aileen tried to bury Mallory's wallet, papers and booze and tumblers and a bunch of condoms in a small divot in the sand, but she failed to do a proper job. Then Aileen wiped down the traces of blood in the car with a red beach towel and wiped the car clean of fingerprints. Thereupon, she grabbed her bike from the trunk and rode away, tossing the keys to Mallory's car in some bushes as she went. What are you doing? Don't wipe that down. Set it on fire. Look, just light the car on fire. What's wrong with you? But do like they do in the movies. I don't know if it works. Get that towel, dip it in gasoline, and then tuck it into the place where you put the petrol in and set it on fire, and then just run away real fast, and then watch it and make sure it catches on fire. And everything that you want burned, like all your evidence and stuff, put it in the car and then just let it burn. Let it burn really long. Also, while you're at it, take those dentures out and throw them in the ocean. Come on. It's basic crime shit here. Tossing the keys in a bush. Yeah, they're going to find it in the bush. What a great hiding place. While Aileen's second version of events certainly sounds plausible, there is a fly in the ointment for anyone favouring the theory that Aileen Wuornos was just a cold-blooded killer. When British documentarian Nick Broomfield was interviewing Wuornos in prison, there came a moment when she thought that the camera had been turned off. Aileen is recorded saying to Broomfield, quote, "I can't do it. I would never be able to handle a life sentence or anything." And then they've said other things that are really crazy. They do crazy things to people while they're incarcerated. I'd never be able to handle it. So I'm going for the death penalty. I have to, because they're too evil. They're too evil for me to be incarcerated. They're so corrupt. It's not funny. I gotta go down. I have to. That's why I can't say nothing about self-defense on tape or anything. To which Broomfield replied, "But it was self-defense." Wuornos said, "Yes, but I can't tell anybody. Never. I have to go down to the execution. They're too corrupt. They stick together. Hand over fist, hand in glove, man." Broomfield pressed her. "So it was Mallory's self-defense?" Aileen simply replied, "Yes, and so were some others, but there's nothing I can do about it. All they'd do is give me an overturned sentence. They'd never do me righteous. They'd only fuck me over some more with a life sentence, so I can only go to the death penalty." At that point, prison guards entered the room, cutting off the conversation. So the great mystery. in the case of Aileen Wuornos is not whether she was a killer. She definitely was a killer. The mystery is why. Was she a cold-blooded murderer who robbed men for petty cash and brutally executed them to leave no witnesses? Or was the murder of Richard Mallory, and possibly others, in self-defense, sending a mentally ill Wuornos spiraling downward on a spree of further violence? Or was Aileen Wuornos a delusional serial killer possessed by pure madness, taking a sick sort of revenge on men who didn't know her after a lifetime of horrific abuse at the hands of others? The fact that she didn't know that the tape, she thought that they were off the record, and she's just admitting this, feels like, and especially when there's no reason to, like, feels very compelling for the fact that, and the fact that Richard, whatever his face was, did have a history of sexual violence with the R-word prison thing. Feels very compelling, doesn't it? On this particular set of questions, the jury is still very much out. I mean, but there's absolutely, like, you can be like, oh, I'm not sure, all you want, but I'm not sure is all the jury needs for reasonable doubt. I'm not sure. That's enough. And these are the questions that you'll want to ponder as we explore what happened in order to decide for yourself. Meet Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Carol Pittman was born in Rochester, Michigan, on the 25th of February 1956 to Leo Dale Pittman and Diane Pittman, maiden name Wuornos. Diana married Leo 2 years earlier in 1954 when Leo was 18 years old and Diane was just 14. Leo was a hoodlum from Detroit, a stereotypical 1950s quote-unquote greaser with his hair slicked back and a pair of dice tattooed on his arm. He had moved to a small hamlet of Rochester, Michigan, where Diane had caught his eye. According to family, Diane had a wild streak and was already cavorting with the local boys and wanted to run away from home and start an exciting new life somewhere. Diane's father was Lowry Wuornos, an engineer at a Pontiac factory in Michigan's car manufacturing glory days, and her mother, Britta Wuornos, was a housewife. Both Laurie and Britta were of Finnish descent, with their people coming over to Michigan in the late 19th century to work in the iron mines. Laurie and Britta were both alcoholics, and Laurie was rumored to be physically and sexually abusive to Diane to the point that several times he outright R-worded his own daughter. Jesus. Diane had two younger siblings, Barry, who was 10 years old in 1954, and her 1-year-old sister, Laurie. That is like... Okay, what a surprise. Our perpetrator today has a super f***ed up childhood. Leo Pittman also turned out to be abusive, sexually violent, and severely mentally ill. Diane lived in fear of him. 9 months after their marriage, she gave birth to a boy named Keith. A few weeks later, the now 15-year-old Diane fell pregnant again. This is like... I know, like, that history repeats itself or whatever, and it's like, I don't know, if I grew up in some abusive household or whatever, you'd be like, the last thing you'd want to, like, marry into is, like, abuse. But for some reason, it happens. And, like, I'm the opposite. Like, I never had any abuse as a kid. I feel like I had a really nice childhood. And then I married someone who's, like, also nice. And then I also hope that my kids, they'll have a nice childhood. And then they'll also marry someone nice. And that perpetrates rather than the opposite. Christ. In February 1956, she gave birth to a daughter who she named Aileen. This time it was unclear whether the father was Leo, who had abandoned his family shortly after Keith's birth and joined the army, or whether it was Diane's father, Laurie, who had been rumoured by the family to be Aileen's actual biological father, instead of just her grandfather. What? It's not unclear whether the father was Leo, who had abandoned his family, or whether Diane's father, Laurie, who had been rumoured by the family to be Aileen's actual biological father, instead of just her grandfather. Wait, I don't understand. What does that mean? I feel like the family tree is super confusing. This time it's unclear whether the father was Leo. Okay, so that's the potential husband who had abandoned the family shortly after Keith's birth, or whether it was Diane's father, Laurie, who had been rumoured by the family to be Aileen's actual biological father. Oh my god, no! Oh my god, oh my god, no!
No. Yes.
Diane filed for divorce against Leo Pittman in absentia 2 months after Aileen's birth. It is worthwhile to momentarily chase down the rabbit hole of Leo's movements, or sewage pipe as the case may be. He was discharged from the army in 1958. He briefly married another woman and returned to Michigan, but quickly abandoned her as well within a matter of weeks, going to California to work as a shoe salesman for a month. Then Leo drifted around the country and was arrested for a litany of crimes, breaking and entering, assault and battery, giving alcohol to a minor. He also had warrants out for him on several child molestations, but he would cross state lines before he could be apprehended, thus evading the limited police jurisdiction at the time. By 1959, while living in Ohio, Leo was thrown in prison for grand theft auto. Upon his release in 1961, Leo violated his parole by moving to Wichita, Kansas, where he lived with another woman. In November 1962, Leo was arrested for R-word and sodomy of a 7-year-old girl. What? Everyone is a piece of shit in this story. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sent to Larned State Hospital for the criminally insane. In March 1963, Leo escaped from the hospital and traveled back to Michigan. Can't we just kill him already? Just strap him in the chair, where he worked as a mechanic for cash paid under the table. But Leo had to go on the run again. He was implicated in the molestation of 2 more prepubescent girls in Michigan. Kill him. Just kill him. Or lock him up and throw away the fucking key. Police picked him up initially for violating his Ohio parole before putting him in front of a psychiatric judging panel. Look, I don't care if he's crazy. He needs to go to prison. Forever. He needs to be locked in a little room, where he was again diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was locked up at Ionia State Hospital for the criminally insane in June 1964. Can we please put him in like a proper criminally insane place, like you see in the movies, where they're just in a padded room? Forever. Leo Pittman was extradited to Kansas in September 1965, where he was tried for the R-word and sodomy of a 7-year-old girl in Wichita. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 21 years for good measure. Thank fucking God, finally. 3.5 years later, on January the 15th, 1969, Leo tried to self-delete himself with a bedsheet in his cell. He suffered severe trauma to his neck and fell into a coma. Leo Pittman died in hospital without ever regaining consciousness on January the 30th, 1969. So I think, which we can all say, oh no! Oh no, what a shame! Let's break out the fucking champagne. Aileen Wuornos never met the man who may or may not have been her biological father. If he was, then we have a family history of schizophrenia to consider. Then again, if Laurie Wuornos had impregnated his own daughter, Diane, then you've got an emotionally volatile and extremely drunk as Eileen's biological father instead. Yeah, not to mention all of the that's not going to be genetically good, is it? Good lord. Traits that Aileen would also come to possess. One could even make a fairly solid argument based upon what we know that Laurie Wuornos was a psychopath or had an associated personality disorder. Mentally well people do not R-word their children. Even if Laurie was only Eileen's grandfather, he could still have passed down some of that mental illness along with a volatile temper and alcoholism mixed with Leo's genes. The odds of Aileen being mentally stable were not great. No, this is the making of a fucking murderer. Good lord. Meanwhile, back in August 1956, Diane Wuornos and her 2 children were thrown out of the house by Laurie and Britta. The reason cited was Diane's parents were disgusted with her for marrying Leo Pittman and paradoxically for her equally shameful divorce. The now 17-year-old Diane moved to the town of Troy, Michigan, where she lived in a cheap apartment with her 2 children, Keith and Aileen. Diane worked any unskilled job that she could find to support her family. She recalled getting very little sleep. Diane's aunt, Carol Connell, took pity on her, as did her relatives, Bernard and Alma Kupas. The family knew Laurie and Britta were abusive drunks and figured that Diane was better off without them. They regularly offered to babysit Aileen and Keith while Diane was at work. Diane struggled as a single mother for almost 4 years. Then, in January 1960, when Aileen was nearly 4 years old and Keith nearly 5, Diane asked Carol Connell to look after the kids while she went out for dinner. A few hours later, Diane called Bernard and Alma Kupos. She instructed them to pick up her 2 children and take them to their grandparents' house in Rochester. Diane explained that she was leaving town and wanted her children to be looked after by Laurie and Britta Wuornos. A baffling choice of guardians, given that she had other less abusive relatives, but maybe they couldn't afford to take the kids. Keith Wuornos always remembered the last time he saw his mother, watching her leave through a screen door as she headed off to, quote-unquote, dinner. I gave them up so they could live in good conditions, but they never lived in bad conditions with me. She also hoped that Aileen would forgive her. Good conditions. You gave them to good lord. You know where you left them, right? It turns out living with Laurie and Britta Wuornos was the furthest thing from quote-unquote living in good conditions, and Diane should have known that. Years later, while on death row, Aileen Wuornos was not charitable when discussing Diane. Quote, "Let me tell you something. She plopped me out of her belly, left me with my grandparents, and we never knew her. So tell that damn I could give a that she even had me, and let me go to Texas. All of us never saw her again, except at funerals. I could care less. I don't give a damn about that. I don't know her. I never even knew her. She could go to hell. She doesn't have any of my forgiveness." On March the 18th, 1960, Laurie and Britta Wuornos illegally changed Keith and Eileen's birth certificates to say that they were their parents, not their grandparents. For years, Keith and Aileen believed this was true. Laurie and Britta were still a relatively young couple. In 1960, Laurie and Britta's eldest son, Barry Wuornos, was 16, and their daughter, Laurie, was 7. Oh, there's Laurie and Lowry, or Lowry and Laurie. Aye. Keith and Aileen, turning 5 and 4 in August that year, fit the picture fairly well. Aileen didn't even know Diane existed until she was 11, and to her dying day, Aileen Wuornos referred to Britta and Laurie as her mother and father. But we should not mistake Eileen's choice to call her grandparents mum and dad as a sign of a happy childhood. Laurie Wuornos began to physically and sexually abuse Aileen when she was very young. Oh my lord. Including R-wording her just like he had done to Diane. Additionally, Laurie would make Aileen strip completely naked, before administering a savage beating. We're not talking about spanking here. Laurie outright battered Aileen with the intention of causing her pain and harm. This was once witnessed by Aileen's childhood friends, Michelle Chauvin. One day, they had skipped school and got in court. Michelle watched as Laurie bent Aileen over a chair and thrashed her for a solid 5 minutes. To quote Michelle, "I don't know what you want me to say. He was a bastard. He beat the hell out of her with a black belt that was around his waist. It left me hypnotized. He was aware I was watching." Laurie's sexual predations on his granddaughter, or biological daughter as the case may be. Good lord, this is so fucked up. Left permanent mental scars on Aileen that began to show from an early age. What a surprise. Jesus. Like in many cases of child sexual abuse, this came in the form of hypersexuality. By 9 years old, Aileen was exchanging blowjobs for cigarettes. 9! By age 11, this had extended to alcohol and drugs. By then, it was the late 1960s and a drug epidemic had swept Aileen's small town. Even the young preteens jumped in with both feet. Aileen was smoking pot, dropping LSD, taking mescaline, and being fed an assortment of various pills. She became known around the neighborhood for allowing all the boys to have sex with her in exchange for money, booze, or drugs. Indeed, 12-year-old Aileen was even witnessed having sex with multiple boys in a tree fort. And these same boys later testified that they saw Aileen having sex with her older brother Keith on several occasions. Aileen has left no doubt about these claims. What the is going on? From the age of 13, Aileen sold herself to older men since they had more money. This included Laurie Wuornos' friends. The following year, in the summer 1970, Aileen claimed that she'd been R-worded by an unknown assailant in his 30s or 40s. At the time, Aileen said the man picked her up by the side of the road, took her to the local gas station, bought her a soft drink, and drove off with her, R-worded her, and then came home. Or at least that's the story she gave to a social worker in Michigan's Children's Aid Society 3 months later. This was because Aileen, a 14 years old, was pregnant. It had been speculated that Aileen was impregnated during the course of her underage sex work, or even that the real father was Laurie Wuornos. Regardless, in December 1970, Laurie threw a heavily pregnant Aileen out of the house, saying she'd disgraced the family. Aileen began sleeping in cars, at friends' houses, and sleeping rough outside, all while pregnant and during Michigan winters, which frequently fell below freezing and could drop as low as minus 22 Fahrenheit or minus 30 Celsius. This is like... I mean, we've seen some pretty crazy upbringings on Casual Criminalist, but I think this must be the worst one we've ever seen, right? It feels literally almost unbelievable that people go through this. Whew. Although Aileen had been thrown out of the house, her grandmother, Brutal Upbringing, helped her through her pregnancy. She drove Aileen to the Children's Aid Society when she found out Aileen was pregnant, and on January the 19th, 1971, drove her all the way to Detroit to stay at the Florence Crittenden Maternity Home for unwed mothers. However, Britta did not try to convince her husband to allow Aileen back into the house, saying, quote, "He's not a bad man. He's strict, but not bad." Oh, he's a horrible monster. When he says something, he expects it to be done. He only means the best for the children. He loves them. Oh, fuck. Stockholm Syndrome or what? And I mean, you're also savage. Savages. Aileen, having just turned 15, gave birth to a son on March the 23rd, 1971. She named him Keith in honor of her brother, with whom she shared an incestuous relationship. The baby was immediately taken from her and put up for adoption. Aileen was then permitted to come back to her grandparents' home. Brutal Upbringing had given up drinking 2 years prior due to her rapidly declining health, but it was too late. On July the 7th, 1971, she died of liver failure at 54. Aileen blamed herself for her grandmother's death, saying that it was the stress of the pregnancy that had killed her off prematurely. It wasn't. It was her liver because she drank too much. Shortly after Britta's funeral, Laurie Wuornos called his daughter, Diane, in Houston, Texas. Laurie was heavily intoxicated on the phone. He told Diane to come and get her children and to get them out of his house, or else he was going to murder them. Diane said she would come, but would not stay under his roof. Laurie replied, "What's the matter? You think if you stay, I'm going to kill you too?" Diane traveled up to Michigan and spoke to Keith, now 16, and Aileen, aged 15. Diane offered to take them both to Texas with her. They asked if they could smoke pot if they lived with her. Diane said no. Keith and Aileen did not seem enthused, and nothing came of it. Diane did not press the issue and returned to Texas without her children, leaving them with an abusive drunk. Prior to leaving, Diane visited the coroner, who told her that Britta had died of liver failure and that at the time of her death, her body had been badly bruised. Diane, being a first-hand witness to Laurie beating his wife and being on the receiving end of Laurie's abuse herself, always suspected that Laurie had murdered Britta. Quote, "I watched my mother drink for many years when I lived in that house, and my mother was not a fall-down drunk. She did not get bruises all over her body from drinking." After the death of Brutal Upbringing, Aileen was again thrown out of the house. She dropped out of school and began working full-time as a town sex worker at 15 years old. Aileen was socially rejected by the majority of the townsfolk, and many kids her age used to bully her. Aileen sometimes had to sleep out in the woods in hastily constructed shelters made from dead trees, cardboard, and debris from the trash. One of her companions in the woods was Dennis, a homeless boy her age who allegedly had gender dysphoria, though in the 1970s people employed other more insulting terms. They sometimes slept in a ramshackle shelter together. When the winter came, it was harsh. To quote Aileen, it was living hell. I mean, sleeping in the snow. Or sleeping in snowy weather in a vehicle or on cinder blocks. I think I had one blanket and one pillow. It's ice cold outside. Sleeping outside in the woods, on the ground, in the snow. I was frozen, man. I still got marks. My toes are blue to this day. The bottom of my feet are blue. My hands hurt. As you can see, they're frostbite looking. When she was lucky, Aileen was able to stay with her friend, Dawn Neiman. They had met through Eileen's now 18-year-old sister aunt. Oh my god, this story in the family tree. Laurie. Dawn and Aileen got along quite well. They did drugs together. Dawn never discussed Eileen's prostitution with her. Years later, Dawn said, quote, "I used to sit and look at her and think, God, they treat her like shit. She had a terrible life. She had a baby and all that. And I could see it in her face. That's why I never put her under any stress. Never put her in a situation, like by asking, are you a prostitute? I already knew this stuff, and that's why she liked me. I just didn't bring it up, because I know it bothered her." Dawn said that the other girls in town tormented Aileen because she got him pregnant and had sex for money. The boys, meanwhile, treated her as a joke, as disposable, with utter disdain. Aileen was even given a nickname, Cigarette Pig, taken from her reputation to perform fellatio merely for spokes. However, after Aileen was arrested and her terrible childhood history became clear, these attitudes changed. Dawn observed, quote, "They don't think it's funny now. They think it's terrible how they treated her. And now everybody comes out of the woodwork and says, oh, I was nice to her. I gave her clothes and stuff like that." No, they didn't. Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I don't think we've seen a childhood that is as rough as that in this whole show, all 100 episodes or whatever. Probably more than 100 episodes, isn't it? Dawn also said that growing up, Aileen Wuornos never gave any sign that she was bisexual or a lesbian. According to Dawn, Aileen never showed any interest in women. However, we have to take this statement with a grain of salt, because Dawn was also on record saying that gay people hadn't been invented yet. Back then, nobody was gay. They only showed up in the 1980s and 1990s. Dawn also said that Aileen never showed much interest in men either, beyond the monetary, when she had become extremely forward with her proposals, making statements like, I'll suck your off. In fact, in her teenage years, Aileen would have sex for free with a boy named Jerry Moss and wanted to be his girlfriend, but he was embarrassed about associating with the quote-unquote cigarette pig in public and used to throw rocks at Aileen, telling her to fuck off. In 1971, Keith Wuornos dropped out of school and joined the army. Eileen's 27-year-old brother-uncle Barry did a few years in the Air Force, then came home, got married, and landed a factory job. Laurie, Eileen's sister-aunt, now age 18, had been spared her father's physical and sexual abuse growing up. Laurie was also fairly oblivious to her father's sexual abuses of Aileen, though she did once see her father kiss Aileen on the mouth and stick his tongue down her throat. Bruh. In front of his wife, Britta, no less. Laurie once made the mistake of allowing Aileen to stay in the house when her father wasn't home. When he arrived home unexpectedly, he was so enraged that Laurie never dared to do that again. It was in 1971 that Laurie first witnessed Eileen's alcoholism and violent temper. Laurie was babysitting at a neighbor's house when Aileen showed up drunk. Laurie was alarmed and told Aileen to go away, calling her crazy. That word sent Aileen into a rage, and she ran into the kitchen, grabbed a meat skewer, and held it to Laurie's throat. Aileen then screamed at Laurie that she hated her and she ought to kill her. Laurie burst into tears. Aileen backed off, and Laurie ran out of the house. This was the sort of behavior that, whether genetic or inculcated by years of trauma, Aileen became known for. I think it's a combination of both. I mean, one, her upbringing is insane, as we've discussed. Also, her, hereditary stuff, the genetics are also, best case, she's inheriting some bad traits, like the alcoholism, the temper, the stuff like this. Worst case, she's inheriting that, and also the genetic problems of incest. Good lord. Her friends, Dawn Neiman, once likened Aileen Wuornos to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Once Aileen attacked Dawn with a cue ball, but Dawn actually won the fight, flipping Aileen over a car. Aileen also attacked her brother Keith with a knife, and Keith gave her a black eye in the struggle. Aileen also once threatened to kill Barry's wife, Judy, and when Judy did not take the threat seriously, Aileen said, quote, I've already killed somebody and chopped them up into little pieces and put them out in a field. After graduation, Laurie got married to a man named Irvin Grody and moved to Colorado. 3 times Aileen traveled down to stay with him. Laurie felt immense sympathy for Aileen, but her stays always ended up with Aileen falling into a drunken rage and being asked to leave. Laurie once discussed with her brother Barry whether they should have Aileen committed to a mental institution, but Laurie abandoned the idea, being too afraid of what Aileen might do if she ever found out. More thorns than petals. On one of Aileen's visits to Colorado on May the 27th, 1974, now 18-year-old Aileen was arrested for sleeping in a stolen Volkswagen Beetle and trying to use the owner's stolen license to identify herself. Aileen spent 10 days in jail before being bailed. She failed to appear in court and fled the state, leaving an outstanding warrant in her wake, the first official milestone in Aileen's criminal history, which is kind of amazing when you consider how the stuff that she's got up to so far. Meanwhile, in the same year, 1974, Aileen's brother Keith discovered he had throat cancer during an army physical. He had surgery to have the tumor removed, but it came back and spread to the rest of his body. Wow. He got throat cancer? How old was he? He's like her age, isn't he? He had surgery to have the tumor removed. Keith went to the Veterans Hospital in Detroit and underwent 18 months of chemotherapy. At the time of his diagnosis, Keith Wuornos was only 19. Still addicted to drugs from his time in Michigan, Keith had a friend of his deliver various pills to him in the hospital. This friend even injected LSD into Keith's IV drip when the nurse wasn't looking. Isn't that super unusual? Like, I thought throat cancer was what people get when they're like 60 after years of smoking. At the start of 1976, Aileen had shrunk down to Florida to avoid spending another frozen January outside in the woods. At this point, Aileen was on the verge of turning 20 years old, having been a forest-dwelling homeless sex worker for half a decade. On her way to Florida, she was picked up by 69-year-old Louis Gratz-Fell, the blue-blooded president of a yacht club. They quickly got engaged. Aileen saw in Louis her meal ticket and managed to behave herself for a short while, treating him very sweetly. Many people who knew Aileen attested to the fact that she could be very sweet, if foul-mouthed woman, when she wasn't flying into a rage. As for Louis, the aging patrician only saw a young blonde woman who'd engaged with him in sex. A trophy wife for his winter years. As Laurie's husband, Irvin Grody, once wryly remarked, quote, "He wanted the prize, and he got the prize. All right. Surprise." It wasn't long before Aileen embarrassed Louis by becoming a fixture at a local bar near their holiday home in Florida, often getting into drunken fights and at one point being arrested for assault. Meanwhile, back in Michigan, Laurie Wuornos had sold the family home and moved into the basement of his son Barry's house. Apparently, Laurie had never gotten over Britta's death and was depressed. The drinking problem didn't help. He didn't eat well and ceased bathing. On March the 12th, 1976, when Barry and his wife were asleep, Laurie went out to the garage and started the car, but didn't open the garage door. He was found the following morning. Aileen did not return to Michigan to attend the funeral. She married Louis Gratz-Fell in Kingsley, Georgia, in May. Oh no! Laurie, the piece of killed himself. And all I can say to that is, too good. Should have done it sooner. In July 1976, Aileen and Louis rolled into Michigan in a nice new Cadillac. Aileen claimed she was blissfully happy. To Louis's frustration, Aileen left him at the motel and went out to bars at night. Meanwhile, Aileen was frustrated that Louis would only give her $30 at a time to go out clothes shopping, or roughly $160 in modern money. Wait, so they're staying... This guy's like blue-blooded and rich, right? He's 69 and he's married to this young girl. Why? Motels aren't nice. Like, I've stayed at motels. They're not nice places. Why are you staying at a motel?
Cheap bastard.
The two had a confrontation, and Aileen wound up beating the elderly Louis with his own walking stick. At the time, Aileen had lied that actually Louis had been beating her, inverting what had happened to make herself seem like the victim. But to her sister aunt, Laurie, Aileen privately admitted the truth. Money be damned. She had simply beaten up the old man. On July the 13th, 1976, Aileen went to drink and play pool at a bar called Bernie's Club in Mansalona, Michigan. She gradually got intoxicated, started shouting at other patrons and making threats. When the bartender stepped in, Aileen threw a cue ball at his head. She missed, but Aileen had thrown the cue ball with such force that it became embedded in the wall. Good lord! If she had struck the bartender in the head, it would have likely killed him. Aileen was arrested and charged with assault and disturbing the peace. Sounds like she should be charged with attempted murder. While in the drunk tank, she threatened the police by claiming that she was an undercover narcotics agent from Colorado and should have them busted down to traffic duty if they didn't let her go. It's like, do you know who I am? Come on. Give it a fucking rest. How drunk are you? Very drunk. She was released the next morning when Louis Gratz posted her bail. Then Louis immediately left Michigan and filed a restraining order against Aileen from the safety of Florida. Smart man, Louis. Well, you weren't so smart, but now you're getting smart, aren't you? A few days later, on July the 17th, 1976, Keith Wuornos finally succumbed to his cancer and died. He was 21 years old. 2 days after that, Jesus Christ, 21 and died from cancer. Woo-wee! 2 days after that, on July the 19th, Aileen received papers from Lewis Gratz informing her that their marriage had been annulled. On the 21st, Aileen attended Keith's funeral. Her mother, Diane, had come up from Texas. Diane avoided Aileen during the funeral and left without speaking to her. 2 weeks later, Aileen hitchhiked her way down to Texas, where she turned up on Diana's doorstep and asked to stay. Aileen vowed to get a job. Yet, whenever Diane got home from work, she'd find Aileen in the living room either drunk or high. Diane was also terrified of Aileen. Quote, "I could see the violence in her, and it frightened me to death." After a couple of weeks of this, Aileen complained that she didn't like living with Diane and said that she was going to leave. Diane was probably like, "Oh no, really? That's so sad." Diane seems to have nearly fallen over herself, offering Aileen money for a bus ticket. "Can you leave now?" Aileen then changed her mind and decided she would stay. Diane wouldn't take no for an answer, however, and insisted on driving Aileen to the bus station. Diane, she's watching her get on that bus. "You get on that, where's that bus going? The other side of the country? Get on that bus. I want to see that bus door close. The door is closed, and then you leave." Diane said she watched Aileen walk straight through the terminal onto the highway and stick out her thumb. But Aileen remembered the event rather differently. Quote, "I hated her guts, and I told her to take me to the freeway and let me out there. She took me to the I-10 in Texas. I wasn't going to put up with her It sounds like she was putting up with your to be honest. Meanwhile, as part of Keith's enlistment in the army, he had a life insurance policy. This was duly paid out to his sister and adopted siblings. Aileen got $10,000 or $53,000 in today's money. She bought a Pontiac Grand Prix with some of the money, along with booze, drugs, guns, and paying a $105 fine for drunk driving. That's pretty nuts. Like, you just get that money, it's like just blow it immediately. Wow. It wasn't long before Aileen crashed the Grand Prix into a telephone pole, totaling the car. She then pissed through the rest of the money with such astonishing speed that by the end of September, she was flat broke. Please take a moment to reflect on that. Aileen Wuornos managed to burn through the modern equivalent of 50 grand in 2 months. Just there, I could do that. Easy. Wuornos headed back, I guess. Yeah, it's a really easy way to burn through money is to buy a brand new car and then smash it into a telegraph pole. Boom, 25 grand, pop. With winter approaching, Wuornos headed back to the highway, stuck at her thumb, and headed to Florida. Here, the record grows hazier because we no longer have Aileen's relatives around to provide first-hand witness accounts. But what we do know indicates somewhere between a downward spiral and a total show. In August 1977, 21-year-old Aileen was arrested by police for driving a car drunk without a license and firing a .22 caliber pistol out of the window as she went. This reminds me of, what was the guy's name at the beginning of the episode? This reminds me of the sort of shit that he'd get up to. Richard something or other. Old Dick. He's drunk, he's drinking vodka in his car, he's shooting a gun out of a window. Somehow it feels very American, doesn't it?
You and I were meant to be together forever.
Is this happening in Florida? I think it is, right? That's perfect. She weaved in and out of traffic, causing other motorists to swerve and avoid hitting her as the police tried to hold her vehicle. When she was finally stopped, the cops discovered that she had a .129 blood alcohol level, or what a woman her weight would achieve with approximately 7 standard drinks. She was fined, brought up on charges, and prohibited from operating a vehicle. But in December 1977, she was arrested for doing the exact same thing. It's weird when it's like, yeah, what's the punishment for, drink driving, banned from driving, and then you drive again? What's the punishment for driving when you're banned from driving? You're banned from driving. It's like, when are you ever going, what's going on? We need to stop these people from driving somehow. In 1978, at the age of 22, Aileen was hospitalized for attempting to self-delete by shooting herself in the stomach. This was her 6th such attempt since the age of 14, the same year she'd gotten pregnant and thrown out of the house for the first time. By 1981, at 25 years old, Aileen had settled, for the most part, in Daytona Beach, where she became a part-time sex worker and a full-time barfly. In the latter capacity, Aileen met 52-year-old mechanic Jay Watts. They became drinking buddies, and then for a few weeks they became lovers. Aileen instigated. Unlike Lewis Fell, Aileen wasn't after Jay's money. He didn't have much anyway. It would appear that, for the most part, she was just after the companionship. They spent a lot of time watching TV together, and she told him several things about her past. They argued occasionally, but Aileen never got violent with Jay. She also laid off the drugs, except for occasionally taking some Quaaludes or other sedatives. Then at 1:30 p.m. on May the 20th, 1981, Aileen walked into the Magic Market on Ridgewood Avenue in Edgewater, Florida, pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and aimed it at the cashier, Elizabeth Smith. uh-oh, you've just escalated your crime substantially because this is robbery, and that's like a decade plus in prison easy. Aileen was shit-faced and dressed in nothing but a bikini, and she managed to rob the store of $35, $115 today, and 2 packs of cigarettes. Aileen got in her car and drove away, but the car broke down not far from the road. Some passers, she's so drunk, and she's just getting in the car. Some passers-by helped push the car to a gas station. This is where the police caught up with her and arrested her for armed robbery. You're going to prison now. Aileen pled guilty and hoping for probation. Come on now. You did armed robbery. There's no probation. She spun up a sob story to the judge about how she was drinking heavily because she was still traumatized by being dumped by her husband in 1976, 5 years earlier. That, like, people get dumped by their husbands often, or their wives often. That's a common thing. What people don't have is your insane abusive past. You could fall back on that a lot more, to be honest. She claimed that her mother had split up the marriage. To her friends, Aileen claimed that she and Jay had fought the night before, and that Aileen had drunkenly thought they'd broken up. The next day, Aileen was feeling suicidal, got blind drunk, and robbed the store, barely aware of what she was doing. One more possibility is that Aileen had been inspired by a cop show that she had watched with Jay the night before, where she expressed a fervent desire to become an outlaw. Indeed, throughout much of her life, Aileen fancied herself a bit of a Bonnie Parker. You were an outlaw for like 15 minutes. You robbed the store, got drunk, your car ran out of petrol, and then you got arrested. Right, yeah. That's a great outlaw career right there. Regardless of the explanation, in January 1982, Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to 3 years in prison at the Lau Correctional Facility, all for some cigarettes and a couple of bucks. Yeah, well deserved. 3 years, I'd say, is a pretty light sentence. It doesn't matter how much you're stealing, you're doing armed robbery. That is a major crime. While in prison, Aileen claimed to have found Christianity. There's some indication that Aileen's conversion was sincere, since it more or less lasted for the rest of her life. But she had a rather simplistic view of religion and never really reflected much on questions of morals and ethics, and hardly became a student of theology. So what part are you? If you're not into the theology, if you're not into the ethics, if you're not into the morals, what part of religion are you into exactly? For the most part, the role of religion for Aileen was to assure her that all the injustices committed against her were understood by God, and that she was assured a place in heaven when she died. Okay, if that's what you want to believe, go for it. Jay Watts visited her in prison and sent her $50 a month for the commissary. Aileen complained about all the lesbians in the prison and was quite sexually voracious when Jay arrived, once trying to initiate sex with him in the prison laundry room. Jay's visits lasted for about a year until they had an argument, and Jay stopped coming around. Meanwhile, Aileen was transferred to the Hollywood Correctional Facility in Pembroke Pines. While in prison, she mailed a single advertisement to a Lonely Hearts rag and began corresponding with 47-year-old engineer Ed Samuels from Washington, D.C. Ed Samuels, what are you up to? Why are you corresponding with someone who's in prison for armed robbery? What is going on in your life, Ed Samuels? He was divorced and all his children had grown up and left home. Aileen lied that she was a country singer who had gone to prison for committing theft at a fast food restaurant. Oh, okay. Well, that's slightly forgivable, Ed. But still, how about instead of replying to the singles columns about, incarcerated, just reply to the people who aren't incarcerated. There's plenty of people who aren't incarcerated, Ed. Aileen was paroled after serving 18 months of her sentence, being released in August 1983. She immediately went to the highway and hitchhiked to Washington, D.C., blowing a truck driver for some cash along the way. A rather desperate Ed was disappointed when he met her. Although Aileen was only 27, the constant drinking, drugs, sleeping rough, and time in prison had taken their toll and eviscerated what was left of her youth. Ed observed she looked 40 or 50. Yeah, hard living makes you look old. I try not to live too hard because I don't want to look super old. It's don't drink too much, don't eat too much, don't smoke, because it makes you age. Additionally, and it makes you die young as well. I don't think Aileen Wuornos is going to live very old, right? Oh, well, she's going to be executed, right? Maybe, if I remember correctly. Additionally, when Aileen met Ed for the first time, she was blind, slobbering drunk. And one of the first things she said to Ed was that she was a lesbian and that he was not allowed to touch her. Ed, nevertheless, took her into his home. He was lonely and hungry for companionship, and he would take whatever he could get. Aileen was generally friendly and had a good sense of humor and could tell a good story. Ed paid Aileen some money to clean the house and mow his lawn. Unbeknownst to Ed, Aileen supplemented her income by working as a sex worker. A couple of times while Aileen was staying with Ed, she hitchhiked from Washington, D.C. to Florida for a few days, drank and hooked before returning home. That's a long way, isn't it? Washington to Florida? On one of her trips, Aileen ran into Jay Watts. They went to his apartment and seemed to be ready to have sex, but Aileen turned him down. They argued, then she begged him for a $50 loan. Jay cut her a check. Later, Jay discovered that Aileen had also stolen $80 in small change they'd been saving, along with using the $50 check to forge another one for $100. In all, Aileen ripped Jay off for $690 in modern money. You piece of... this was the guy
who was your mate, and then you went to prison and he kept sending you money, so you had some like money for noodles or whatever, and then you rip him off. That's really bad. I know you've done like worse stuff, but that's really bad. In October 1983, after 2.5 months living with Ed, to his surprise, Aileen said that she was horny and proposed they have sex. Ed remarked that he thought she was a lesbian, to which Aileen replied that she was only joking. Then, bizarrely, 5 minutes after they'd had sex, Aileen threatened to kill Ed with a kitchen knife. Ed was absolutely baffled by this sudden mood swing. A few days later, Ed drove Aileen to a clinic where she wanted to bluff her way into some prescription sedatives. While Ed was still there with her, he spoke briefly to a counsellor who quietly advised Ed to take Aileen's death threats very seriously and get out of her life as soon as possible. Oh my lord, if someone's telling you that, you're like, okay, there's obviously something that I'm not seeing. You gotta leave. Ed bided his time for a couple of weeks until one evening, Aileen drank so much that she passed out. Then Ed called the Finnan Psychiatric Centre in Cumberland and had some men in white coats come along and take her away. Aileen was admitted for observation and was kept institutionalized for several days. Ed visited a couple of times while she was there and made clear that she was not permitted to return to his home. When Aileen was released, she didn't attempt to do so. And at this point, this is what Ed does. Deep sigh of relief from Ed there. Only once in April 1984 did Ed receive a phone call from Aileen asking if she could stay with him. Ed replied with a polite, "Hell to the no," and hung up the phone. Ed, you have made a very smart decision, and I hope this is the last we hear from you in this script, because please move on with your life. Bonnie and Tyra. On the 1st of May, 1984, Aileen Wuornos was arrested on the island of Key West in the Florida Straits for trying to cash 2 forged checks worth $5,595, or $16,200 in today's money. Good lord. That's bold. That feels like big crime right there. That's pretty big fraud. When she was bailed, she fled to the islands and did not show up in court. She made her way back to Daytona Beach on the east coast of Florida. With no regular job and no fixed address, Aileen was basically off the grid and very difficult to track down. She rarely used her real name with strangers. What is more, there were plenty of offenders like that in Florida in the 1980s, so she basically got off the forgery charge scot-free. So, just because they couldn't track her down, they're like, hey, whatever. I always feel like Catch a Criminal is like people go on the run and eventually they're caught, and it's like, no, for most of the shit that she does, she just leaves the state or just doesn't tell the police where she is, doesn't show up, and it's like, it seems to be fine. Around this time, Aileen began her first known lesbian relationship with a woman named Tony, with whom Aileen said she wanted to start a pressure cleaning business. Meanwhile, Aileen continued to fund herself by working as a quote-unquote professional cool girl, as she liked to call it, walking along Florida highways. It was during this period that Aileen developed the strategy of hitching a ride, not immediately indicating she was a sex worker, and after a friendly chat, claiming poverty and offering sex for money. On November the 30th, 1985, Aileen was picked up by a man named Dennis on the I-75 south of Ocala in central Florida. Aileen told Dennis her name was Laurie Grody, which was actually the married name of her sister aunt who now lived in Arizona. Dennis paid Aileen for sex, and then, after she left, he noticed that she'd stolen his .38 caliber revolver from his glove compartment. Due to Aileen's use of a false name, she was not caught at the time, but she was listed as a suspect. A little over a month later, on January the 4th, 1986, Aileen was in Miami driving a stolen Chevy Blazer when she tried to evade police checkpoint by turning around and driving in the opposite direction. You're just driving up to the police checkpoint like, uh-oh. Let's reverse. Turn him, just pull a Yui. The police would be like, maybe we should follow that person. He just like saw the police checkpoint and turned around. Police gave chase. Surprise, surprise. Pulled her over and asked to see her license. Aileen said that she'd left it at a store. She again identified herself as Laurie Grody. Police ran the plates on the Chevy and found out that it was stolen. While searching the vehicle, police found the .38 revolver and a box of ammunition. Aileen tried to flee the scene by trying to hijack a nearby car. What are you up to? But before Aileen could eject the startled motorist, police tackled her and put her in cuffs. She was charged with car theft and resisting arrest. After making bail, the so-called Laurie Grody neglected to turn up for trial. Police. Someone is in your custody who says, yeah, my name is John Smith. And they don't have any ID, they don't have anything like that, and then they bail themselves and get out of the prison. They are not coming back, police. What are you possibly thinking? Meanwhile, the details of Aileen's breakup with a woman named Tony remain unclear. Aileen claimed that she bought Tony that pressure cleaning business with her hooker money, and immediately thereafter, Tony disappeared. Whatever the explanation, by 1986, Tony had long since disappeared into the rearview mirror of one of Aileen's stolen vehicles. Excellent, Tony. Glad you got out of the picture. Tony and Ed so far. Avoiding a disaster, and also what was the name of the old dude who she beat up with a stick? Christ. Trail of disaster with Aileen here.
On June the 2nd, 1986, Aileen was picked up by a guy named Wayne Manning near Below State Park, just to the north of Daytona Beach. During the ride, Aileen accused Wayne of stealing $200 from her and demanded he give it back. When Wayne asked her what the hell she was talking about, Aileen pulled a .22 caliber pistol on him. Wayne continued to argue, and during their dispute, their vehicle was pulled over by a park ranger. Aileen quickly stashed the gun under her seat and gave the officer the false name of Laurie Grody. Why using the same false name that they already have you listed down of for skipping bail? Use a new false name. It's not hard. Just be like, yeah, Grody Laurie. Just anything to throw it off. Just a different name, Aileen. Wayne, however, immediately told the ranger that Aileen had tried to rob him at gunpoint, and it didn't take long for the ranger to find the weapon. Aileen denied it was hers, but when the park ranger found .22 caliber bullets in Aileen's bag, she was arrested for illegally carrying a concealed firearm. Wayne, meanwhile, was arrested for car theft since he had stolen the vehicle he was driving from his grandfather. Guys, how dumb are you? It's all right. If you've stolen the car from your grandfather, just be like, everything's fine, Ranger. Don't be like, I've been robbed. Although maybe he thought he was in more danger than... Because his grandfather's probably not going to press charges, is he? Although he did report it stolen. So that's interesting. As a result of Wayne also being a scumbag, police let the armed robbery allegation slide. Once again, for the firearm offense, the so-called Laurie Grody did not show up for trial. What the fuck is going on, police? It's like, oh yeah, that guy's a piece of shit as well. So, yeah, he stole his granddad's car. So we're just going to ignore the fact that he was held up at gunpoint and robbed. What the is going on, police? Also in June 1986, the now 30-year-old Aileen Wuornos met 24-year-old Tyra Moore. 3 years earlier, in 1983, Moore had moved to Florida from Ohio with the settlement money that she had received from a motor collision. She initially found work as a maid at the El Caribe motel, but was fired after she was accused of stealing money. Then Moore shacked up with a divorced woman with 2 kids named Marsha. The relationship lasted about a year, and after their breakup, Moore was arrested for breaking into Marsha's house, allegedly trying to collect the rest of her stuff. Thereafter, Moore became a lodger in the home of Dinky and Cammy Green, a married couple with 2 young sons. Moore was still living there in June 1986 when she met Aileen Wuornos at a Daytona gay bar named the Zodiac. They hit it off immediately and spent the next 3 days in Tyra Moore's bedroom. In 2 years, Aileen was the first woman that Tyra had ever brought home. Unlike many people in the US South, especially in the 1980s, Dinky and Cammy Green had no problem with the fact that their lodger, Tyra Moore, was a lesbian. In fact, while being guilty of stereotyping, Cammy said, quote, "Given Tyra's mega butch appearance, I had already figured that was the case." They also... Just imagine this middle-aged woman saying the words mega butch. Sorry. They also had no problem with Aileen Wuornos moving into the house. Aileen had lied to the Greens, saying that she ran a pressure cleaning business, but Cammy always wondered why. If that was the case, Aileen insisted on hitchhiking to work even when she was offered a ride. Aileen behaved herself extraordinarily well by her standards. In the 2 months she lived with Tyria and the Greens, she kept her temper in check and didn't threaten to kill either Cammy or Dinky at the time. Well, that's nice of her, isn't it? She behaved herself. She threatened to kill barely anybody. Aileen went out on the road for days on end, coming home on the weekend with a bunch of cash, which she and Tyra promptly blew drinking in Daytona bars. Tyra, who knew about Aileen's prostitution, was happy to have the money spent on her. Cammy Green noticed that Aileen was the dominant partner in the relationship, ordering Tyria to shave her legs, which the latter woman disliked doing. Aileen was also jealous and possessive of Tyria, and her jealousy extended to Cammy's friendship with Moore. Cammy found out that Aileen and Tyria had physical altercations, domestic abuse cutting both ways, but wasn't overly worried about it since Cammy figured Tyra was a large woman and could take Aileen in a fight. For her part, Tyra said their scraps were no big deal. Cammy also noticed that Aileen would start drinking first thing in the morning, while Tyra would save her alcoholism for the afternoons and evenings. Like a sensible alcoholic. One day, Cammy discovered Aileen had a black eye. What? When Cammy asked who had beaten her up, Aileen said that she had been R-worded but refused to go to the police. Cammy searched Aileen's possessions and found a bag full of condoms, men's business cards, men's watches and jewelry. It seemed quite clear, combined with the Wayne Manning incident, that in 1986 Aileen had already started regularly mixing sex work with highway robbery. As for Aileen's claim of R-word in this instance, it's unclear whether that was true. Certainly sex workers are at high risk of violence and sexual assault, or whether Aileen had sustained the injury in the course of a robbery. and perhaps lied about it. Aileen and Tyra moved out of the Greens house in August on amicable terms and spent the next month hopping from one Florida motel to another, living off the proceeds of Eileen's sex work. One of the motels, or where they stayed, was the Pierre in the hamlet of Zephyr Hills on the west coast, where Tyra managed to score a job as a cleaning mate. Aileen signed the register as Susan Blahovets, and they stayed at the Pierre until March 1987, when they were asked to leave on account of their excessive drinking and complaints from motel guests about the two women kissing and groping each other in public. Aileen and Tyria motel hopped and occasionally slept rough for another month before returning to the Greens house in April, asking if they could stay again. The Greens were ready to take back Tyra, but were very reluctant to take back Aileen on account of her day drinking and the obvious fact that she was working as a roadside sex worker. Nevertheless, the two women did end up moving back in. This time, Aileen behaved badly, constantly arguing with Dinky Green and at one point flying into a rage and threatening to kill him. Don't threaten to kill your landlord, you're gonna get thrown out. Dinky laughed it off. Okay. Dinky and whatever your wife's name is, Connie or whatever, you need to get out of these people's lives now, Dinky, come on. Also, who's called Dinky? But Cammy was alarmed. Cammy, that was the name, thank you. Additionally, Tyra and Aileen also took to getting sexual in front of the Greens' two sons, which Dinky and Cammy thought was a bit of a bridge too far. Yeah, no fucking The two lodgers did not pay rent, but they ate the Greens' food, and several times Dinky told them to move out, but it was ignored. In May 1987, that was when I was born. Aileen stole Cammy's driver's license and used it as a false ID, and said nothing when Cammy was looking for it. Cammy Green later claimed that while living there, Aileen once alluded to the idea of getting rich by robbing men who solicited prostitution and killing them so that they could not act as witnesses. Oh my god, you are suggesting mega crimes. Things are stepping up a pace, aren't they, Aileen? If this story is true, and not just an imposition of hindsight, then it is a clear indication of what Aileen planned to do to men, or even worse, what she was already doing to men whose deaths were never connected to her. When Tyra and Aileen finally moved out of the Greens' house that June, they waited until Cammy and Dinky weren't home, tore the place apart, and took a bunch of the Greens' stuff, loaded into a stolen car, and drove away. Oh, I don't like this. Like, I feel, obviously these people do horrible things, especially, like, Aileen ends up killing people. But when it's like these people have been so good to you, they let you stay in the house for free, like the dude who sent her $50 a month when she was in prison, and then it's just like, yeah, just gonna rob him. It's like, that's so f***ed up. That person must be like, what the f***? And then you think, like, if you're that person, you're like, oh my god, people are bad. People are bad. And that's just not nice. I mean, obviously. But it's just, I don't know, it feels like such a piece thing to do. The two women drifted again in the summer of 1987, living in cheap motels, sleeping rough, and spending Eileen's prostitution money in bars. On July the 4th, 1987, they got into a fight at the Barn Door Lounge, allegedly assaulting a man with a beer bottle and knocking him to the ground. Tyra had to go to the hospital with multiple scalp lacerations. Aileen and Tyra were arrested and questioned by the police about the incident, but they were never charged. In August 1987, Tyra found work as a maid in another motel, allowing her and Aileen to afford a small apartment in Oleander Avenue in Daytona. There followed a relatively quiet period in her life, punctuated only by Aileen getting ticketed in January and February for 1988 for walking on the interstate highway in search of sex work. Aileen disputed these tickets and wrote a few profanity-laced letters to the traffic court in protest. Yeah, that's going to help. You, I'm not paying your tickets. It's like, okay, look, you got to pay the tickets. You got to pay the tickets. Along with signing them under a false name. The officer noted on one of her tickets, quote, attention, poor, and she thinks she is above the law. What do you have to say about this person? Any notes? Yeah, broke ass. On the 12th of March 1988, Aileen and Tyra were riding a bus in Daytona when Aileen decided to pick a fight with the driver, Gary Thompson. The confrontation got physical and Thompson wound up grabbing Aileen and throwing her out of the bus door. Aileen decided to go to the police and file an assault complaint, using Tyra Moore as a witness. Aileen identified herself to the Daytona police as Cammy Green. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given how Aileen probably behaved at the station while making the complaint, police chose to not press charges against Thompson. Good. Excellent. Like, Thompson threw off his bus. Let me just guess that Aileen, the police are related, she started that, didn't she? A few months later, Aileen had another altercation with the bus driver and was thrown off. This time, she called the bus company to complain, again giving her name as Cammy. The director of the bus service, George Soloway, being afraid of being sued, drove down to the bus stop himself and, quote-unquote, gave Cammy a ride to a destination in his car. Leaping forward, in December 1990, Aileen filed yet another complaint with the bus service, since, by this point, drivers were refusing to stop for her. Yeah, I'll be just like... Sorry, ladies and gents, you're gonna have to walk from the next stop. Trust me, you don't want that woman to get on the bus as much as I do. Thank you for your attention. On July 23rd, 1988, Tyria and Eileen's landlord called the cops on them, citing vandalism. For some reason, they decided to rip up the carpet in the apartment and paint the walls without permission. No charges were laid, but the two women were evicted. They went back to the Pierre Motel in Zephyr Hills and begged the owner to let them stay and hire Tyria back as a maid. They promised to keep the drinking under control and not make out in front of the guests. The owner needed a maid at the time and accepted. While staying at the Pierre, Tyria and Aileen got a pet cat which got pregnant. The owner told them they needed to sell the kittens, otherwise get rid of them. Aileen flew into a rage and threatened him, but they avoided eviction. On November the 22nd, 1988, Aileen went to the supermarket next to the Pierre and tried to buy some lottery tickets when the clerk, Robert McManus, asked Aileen to repeat the number she wanted. She became incredibly angry and verbally abusive. McManus told her to get out. Between November the 22nd and the 28th, Aileen called the store several times, threatening McManus with death. What is up with you?
So I just want to confirm those numbers.
How dare you? I'll kill you and your family! What the lady? The clerk took these threats seriously enough to begin wearing a bulletproof vest to work. The police, if you're doing any job that shouldn't be dangerous and you have to wear a bulletproof vest, maybe you should get a different job. Christ. The police traced the calls to the Pierre Motel, and Aileen, again using a false name, was let off with a warning. You're threatening to murder someone. What is going on, police? You need to, do something about this. In January 1989, Aileen and Tyra left the Pierre of their own accord and rented a trailer in an RV park just north of Tampa for $95 a month or $230 in today's money. It's a bargain. I mean, I know you're living in a trailer park, but still, that seems like very little money. Aileen began servicing regular clients who would come to the trailer while continuing to have sex with strangers out on the road and perhaps sometimes also robbing them. Aileen and Tyra would shoot beer cans for target practice outside of the trailer with firearms that they'd stolen from God knows where. On several occasions, the neighbors witnessed Aileen and Tyra beating the shit out of each other. The two women stayed together in the RV park north of Tampa until the autumn of 1989 before drifting across the peninsula to Daytona, where they took up residence at the Ocean Shores Motel. Soon after, Tyra got a job working as a maid at the upmarket Casa del Mar. At that point, Aileen began hooking and probably robbing almost exclusively on the road again. Aileen spent most of her earnings on booze and various presents for Tyra Moore. Tyra kept her wages mostly for herself. I'm beginning to recognize this story. Casa del Mar, isn't that the upmarket place where the cold open opened with? Are we going to be getting back to Richard's wild life? I think so. On November the 23rd, 1989, Aileen cooked a Thanksgiving dinner for Tyra and one of her work friends named Sandy. Aileen had lovingly prepared a large frozen TV dinner with turkey and vegetables. During the meal, Aileen got stinking drunk and began waving around a .22 pistol. Then she showed Sandy the scars she had from knife and bullet wounds on her abdomen. Although Sandy liked Tyra, she came away feeling uncomfortable about Aileen. She seemed unhinged and possibly violent. What could give you that idea? 8 days later, on December the 1st, 1989, Richard Mallory was shot to death just north of Daytona Beach. Yes, that's where we opened the episode. I knew it was coming. As soon as that Casa del Mar or whatever was mentioned, I'm like, this is where we join things up. Richard Mallory's car was found abandoned in the late afternoon of December the 1st, and his body was discovered not far away on December the 13th. He'd been shot 5 times with a .22 caliber pistol. During the initial investigation, police suspected Mallory's old associate with ties to cocaine, Michael Rosenblum. Oh, right, the man that had bailed out of prison. God, that feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? This is a long episode.
There's so much left to do.
But the man had a fairly solid alibi for the night of November the 30th, when Mallory was last seen. Police also suspected Chastity Lee Marcus, one of the strippers Mallory had taken back to his electronics store the night of the 30th. Chastity couldn't keep her story straight due to her drug use, and she fled to Louisiana for no reason. She had a rap sheet a mile long in association with Florida bikers. She was also implicated by false claims made to the police by a jealous ex-boyfriend, Doug Lambert. But eventually, Chastity was given an alibi by a man named Biker Bob. Ah, the source of all reliable alibis. Biker Bob. At the time, the police had no way of connecting Aileen Wuornos to the crime, as she was not on the list of suspects. Meanwhile, on the evening of December the 1st, 1989, ensconced in their new apartment, Aileen told Tyra Moore that she had killed a man early that morning. Tyra claims this was the first she'd ever heard about Aileen murdering people. Can you imagine that conversation? Killed someone this morning.
I did you? I had a lovely day as well, thank you.
Tyra also claims that she, quote, wanted out of the relationship right then and there, but I was scared. Yeah, no, I killed someone this morning. Okay. I'll pack my bags. Quietly, please don't kill me. On December the 6th, 1989, Aileen sold a camera and radar detector that she'd stolen from Richard Mallory's car at the OK Pawn Shop in Daytona Beach. That is something you should have thrown in the car and burned. In order to make the sale, Aileen used Cammy Green's stolen driver's license and was required to dip her thumb in ink and leave a fingerprint for the shop's records. That's clever. I didn't realize they'd do that. In exchange for making such an incriminating mistake, Aileen was paid $30, or just shy of $73 in today's money. But for now, the items remained unconnected to Mallory. As far as we know, Aileen kept her head down for the next 6 months and did not kill again. In the meantime, she grew increasingly jealous of Tyra's friendship with her workmate Sandy, who was straight as an arrow but had formed a very tight bond with Tyra. Aileen's jealousy was also piqued by the visit of Tyra's 18-year-old half-sister Tracy, who did not smoke, drink, or do drugs. Aileen feared Tracy might steal Tyra away to a more straight-laced life. For their part, both Sandy and Tracy were wary of Aileen and tried to stay out of her way. Smart move. Everyone should be wary of Aileen. On the 1st of June, 1990, the body of a middle-aged white man was found naked, except for a baseball cap on his head, lying in the woods of Chassahowitzka National Park, just off Route 19, approximately 40 miles north of the city of Tampa. He had been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber pistol. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Decomposition was advanced, and the local wildlife had torn off a large amount of skin and soft tissue from his head, abdomen, and hands. Oh, bro. Frustrating identification of the victim. Yes, no shit. The animals ate his face. Police trawled the database looking for a missing person who fit the corpse's general description. Man. Missing face. On June the 7th, the victim's teeth were matched by forensic dentist to one David Andrew Spears, a 47-year-old construction worker from the town of Winter Garden, just west of the city of Orlando. Spears was divorced with 3 children, having amicably split with his wife Dee in 1984, but the two were entertaining the idea of remarriage. This is so sad. Spears had bought his ex-wife an engagement ring 2 months earlier in April. Spears was on his way to visit Dee and his 3 children on May the 19th, 1990, driving from the I-4 highway from his job at Universal Concrete in Sarasota to Winter Garden. He was last seen leaving work at 2:10 p.m. He never arrived at his destination. Somewhere along the I-5, roughly 30 minutes drive from Dee's house, David Spears had picked up Aileen Wuornos. This would have been uncharacteristic for Spears, since his family, friends, and co-workers all said that he distrusted hitchhikers. In Aileen's initial confession to police, she claimed she convinced him to drive in the opposite direction from Winter Garden. After a while, they pulled over, drank beers, and then Spears paid her for sex. Once they'd gotten naked, Aileen testified that Spears turned violent and tried to bludgeon Aileen with a lead pipe that he had in his pickup truck. I don't believe you. Aileen managed to reach for a .22 caliber pistol in her bag and shot him once as he was attacking her. Then, as Spears tried to flee, Aileen shot him 2 further times. At that point, Spears fell to the ground, and Aileen decided to shoot him 3 more times to finish him off. I don't believe that. I think she just murdered him. Leaving the body where it lay, Aileen stole Spears' truck and drove off with it to Daytona Beach, where she visited Tyra Moore. Aileen stole between $500 and $700, which had been in Spears' wallet in the glove compartment of his truck, or between $1,150 and $1,610 in today's money. Spears had been carrying a week's wages in cash, along with some extra money to buy a present for his daughter, Deanna, who was graduating from high school that month. Aileen Wuornos claimed that she had acted in self-defense. In order to believe that, one would have to accept that David Spears, who was half an hour from the house of his ex-wife, whom he wanted to remarry and whom he wanted to celebrate the graduation of their daughter with, decided instead to be late by a couple of hours and solicit the services of a roadside sex worker. If one does not accept the murder of David Spears was in self-defense, that would mean Aileen Wuornos shot him in cold blood and robbed him either by design or opportunity. The most generous interpretation of that scenario would be that Aileen didn't murder her previous victim, Richard Mallory, in cold blood. He tried to attack her, but David Spears was not, quote, among some of the others she killed in self-defense, which Aileen alluded to on death row. Either by malice afterthought or by some kind of madness that overtook her in the moment, Aileen had straight up executed the man. Yeah, this dude doesn't have any history of violence or anything. Like with the Richard dude, the wild dude, it's like, well, yeah, he had that history of violence. He went to prison or went to that reform thing for R-word. So that seems reasonable, but this just seems like she shot this dude for his money. Which, I mean, she's murder's murder, but cold blood. After visiting Tyria at work, Aileen Wuornos drove the victim's truck 90 minutes to Orange Lake, where she got out, ripped off the truck's license plate with her bare hands and concealed it in a nearby ditch. Then she removed the radio from the truck and took it with her to sell for cash. While walking down the highway, she saw a homeless man and told him that if he needed somewhere to sleep, he could crash in the truck just down the road. she wouldn't be coming back for it. The act of removing the license plate from the truck and driving it 100 miles away prevented it from being linked to David Spears at the time. After police identified Spears' body on June the 7th, they interviewed his work colleagues and ex-wife. Wait, can't they run the VIN? There's cars have vehicle identification numbers. They're printed on the windscreen. She didn't remove that. Or it's printed on the body parts of the car as well. They can run that and find out who owns that car. It's on the documentation. After the police identified Spears' body on June the 7th, they interviewed his work colleagues and his ex-wife. Aside from pointing a finger of suspicion at Spears' boss, whose name was Red Kerr, the police had no suspects. And once again, there was nothing tying Aileen Wuornos to the case. It sounds like he did like his boss. She's like, yeah, maybe he murdered him. Who knows? They really didn't like each other. Meanwhile, on June the 6th, just 5 days after the body of David Spears was found, the body of another middle-aged man was discovered in the woods of Pasco County near the west coast of Florida. The body was naked and had been covered with a green electric blanket. It had lain there for about a week, rotting in the summer heat. The coroner reported that the victim had been shot 9 times with a caliber .22 pistol. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? The wounds and the position of the body indicated that the victim was facing his attacker when he was shot and that he'd taken 9 bullets without trying to flee. The body was so badly decomposed that it hindered identification. Yeah, wow, it's just out there a week and just in that Florida heat, man. Wow. Dental impressions and fingerprints were taken in the hopes that something would come up in either the criminal or missing persons database. The next day, on June the 7th, 1990, police found an abandoned 1975 Cadillac just off the I-75 in Marion County, about 90 minutes drive to the north of where the body had been discovered. At the time, police had no reason to suspect foul play, so they just left the car sitting there and went on with their day. Although the body remained John Doe until December 1990, the license plate indicated that the car belonged to one Charles Cadden, a 40-year-old road digger and rodeo rider from Bonnersville, Missouri. Those are 2 very different jobs. What do you do? Yeah, I work on the roads, laying tarmac, and also I ride bulls. Cadden had been last seen on May the 31st at 4 p.m., dropping off his dog Muffin at his mother's place while he drove 16 hours down to Tampa, Florida to pick up his fiancée Peggy and bring her back to Missouri with him. Jesus Christ, 16 hours down, 16 hours back? I know it's only the 1990s, but can't we fly, people? That's insane! That was only 12 days after Aileen Wuornos had murdered David Spears. Aileen later testified that Cadden had picked her up on the outskirts of Tampa a day or 2 later. According to her story, Cadden had told her that he was a drug dealer and then he paid her for sex. While they were in the backseat of the Cadillac, Aileen Wuornos claims that Cadden held her at gunpoint with a .45 revolver, which indeed Cadden was known to have owned. Somewhere in the ensuing scuffle, Aileen managed to pull out her .22 and emptied an entire clip of 7 bullets into him. She then reloaded her gun and shot him 2 more times for good measure. That's not going to look good. If you just bang, 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 then it's okay, that's self-defense. And then it's that becomes way more intense, doesn't it? That doesn't look good to a jury. It's yeah, well, you killed him, and then you reloaded the gun, and then you shot him 2 more times. Cadden died almost immediately in the backseat of his car. Aileen dumped the body out of the vehicle, covering the victim with an electric blanket. Then Aileen wiped down the back seat and stole the money in Cadden's wallet. Wuornos claimed that he only had $20 on him. Cadden's mother claimed he was carrying closer to $300. Aileen also stole Cadden's .45. Thereafter, Aileen drove off in the victim's Cadillac, heading towards Daytona, where she parked in front of her apartment for several days. Aileen also showed Cadden's .45 to Tyrion Moore, and they both used it for target practice before Aileen went and pawned it. Cadden's mother did not report her son missing until June the 14th, and Florida police did not connect the out-of-state missing persons case to their John Doe victim until December 1990. Thereupon, police went to Marion County to impound his abandoned car. By then, vandals had stolen the back seat, which may have contained traces of human blood, and smashed the headlights. Police found only 1 usable fingerprint on the car, but unfortunately, it belonged to Cadden himself. On the one hand, it seems pretty dubious that Cadden would solicit the services of a roadside sex worker when, after a 16-hour drive, he was on the outskirts of Tampa, where his fiancée lived. Yeah, that seems extremely unlikely. You've just driven 16 hours to go see your fiancée, and you're like, yes, I'm almost there. Oh, I guess I could pick up this sex worker, okay? It just seems very unlikely. On the other hand, being engaged does not preclude a man from having sex with a sex worker, regardless of his geographic proximity to his betrothed. No, but it does seem like a bit unlikely, doesn't it? Because he's driving those 60 hours already thinking, oh, we're going to get it on. And then he's just about to get there. And he's like, I can't wait anymore. Coming apart at the seams. On June the 19th, Aileen had somehow come into a large amount of money and into the possession of a silver grey 1988 Pontiac Sunbird. I wonder how she got that. She used the money and the car to take Tyria Moore and her half-sister Tracy to SeaWorld. On the drive over, a drunken Aileen suddenly became jealous of how well a drunken Tyria and Tracy got along. Aileen threw a tantrum and refused to come inside the park with them. She stood for hours brooding in the parking lot while Tyria and Tracy had fun. Tracy left Florida for a hire the very next day because she couldn't stand being around Aileen anymore. Yeah, don't blame her. Who could possibly stand being around Aileen? She's a terrible person. On July the 4th of 1990 in Orange Springs, a small unincorporated community to the northwest of Ocala, Rhonda Bailey was sitting on her porch with her husband and cousin when they heard the screeching of car tires and a crash. Getting up and heading to the road to see what had happened, they saw a silver grey 1988 Pontiac Sunbird had gone off the road and through a barbed wire fence into the brush where it was stuck. Driving the car was Tyria Moore, and in the passenger seat, bleeding down her arm and swearing loudly at Tyria for how fast she was going, was Aileen Wuornos. Rhonda Bailey offered the woman the use of the telephone to call a tow truck. Aileen refused and Tyria didn't speak. They just got out of the car and started walking quickly down the road away from it. A few minutes later, they ran back down the road and hopped back into the car, this time with Aileen in the driver's seat. They started up the engine and forced the car out of the brush, bending a metal fence post in half and churning up steel wire as they went. Aileen proceeded to drive the car into a field where it sputtered to a halt. Then the two women got out and abandoned it a second time. Aileen and Tyria returned to the highway and started walking, having prioritized taking a cooler of beer with them from the wreck. After a couple of hours, they were spotted by Harmon Jeter, who pulled over and offered them a ride. Jeter noticed Aileen was covered in blood, and the woman explained that she'd been in a car accident. Aileen then asked Jeter if they could get a ride to State Road 40. Jeter said he wasn't headed in that direction, at which point Aileen got abusive and Jeter drove off. It's like, oh, fuck you then. It's like, okay, I'm just going to leave now. Harmon Jeter immediately drove to his brother-in-law's house and phoned the volunteer fire department. Fire Chief Hewitt responded to the call and got into his station wagon with his wife Brenda and drove around the area looking for the two women. When they found them, Hewitt politely asked Aileen if they'd been in a car accident and if they could be of any assistance. Aileen denied that there'd been an accident and started swearing vigorously at the man and his wife. Hewitt and Brenda drove away and reported the incident to the sheriff of Orange Springs. It's like, oh, I was just trying to be nice, just trying to do my job. The sheriff quickly located the Pontiac Sunbird sitting in the middle of a field not far from Rhonda Bailey's house. In the car, the sheriff noticed dry blood stains throughout the interior and also in the trunk of the car. That would be a bit weird, wouldn't it? You'd be like, okay, well, they've been in an accident, so there could be some blood inside the car. But what the f was in the trunk? The blood had been there for several days at least. Uh-oh. He also found a partial palm print on the interior door handle of the driver's side. The sheriff concluded that the palm print was doubtless left by one of the women as she staggered, injured and drunk from the wreck. In 1990, it would take weeks or even months to find a match, if they found one at all. Running the plates, the sheriff discovered the car belonged to Peter Seams, a married 65-year-old retired sailor turned Christian missionary from the town of Jupiter in South Florida. His wife was holidaying in Europe, and their contact was sporadic due to the cost of long-distance phone calls. Seams had left home on June the 7th, intending to drive north to New Jersey to visit his 83-year-old mother, and then on to Arkansas to visit his 23-year-old son. He never made it to Jersey, and was reported missing by his niece who lived in Jupiter on the 22nd of June. Seams went missing only a few days after the murder of Charles Cascaden and roughly 2 weeks after the murder of David Spears. Back on July the 4th, the sheriff at Orange County Springs immediately suspected foul play and contacted Jupiter Police Department, who were quite interested to hear what had happened to Peter Seams' car. Police later spoke to witnesses and came up with sketches of the two women that were seen that day. This was not just car theft. Given Seams had been missing for nearly a month, and there was a large amount of dried blood in the back seat and trunk of his car, it seemed likely that he'd been murdered. Yeah, no shit. It's like, blood in the car, fine. Blood in the trunk. Who the was in the trunk? Perhaps the women had done it, or perhaps they were just two burnouts who had stolen the abandoned car sometime afterward. Aileen Wuornos later testified that Peter Seams picked her up on the I-95 on June the 7th, 3 hours drive north of Jupiter, not far from Daytona. Uh-oh, you murdered him. If the police are like, oh no, we had two options. Either you stole the car after it had been abandoned after someone else murdered him, or you know him and then you definitely murdered him, so you giving the game away a little bit there. Or else, Aileen said perhaps they'd met in a coffee shop. Aileen couldn't remember and claimed she'd been wasted at the time. They crossed the state line into Georgia, then drove roughly 10 miles off the I-95 to a place in the woods that Aileen was unable to pinpoint on a map. There, Aileen claims Peter Seams paid her sex. According to the story, they both stripped off their clothes when the 65-year-old Christian missionary suddenly tried to R-word her. Aileen grabbed her .22 pistol from the bag, but Seams tried to take it from her, letting off a couple of shots into the air as they struggled. Aileen managed to wrench the gun free and fired a shot point blank into Seams's chest. Then, in order to finish him off, she emptied the rest of the clip into him. Rifling through Sims's possessions afterwards, she found a collection of Bibles and an estimated $600 in cash that he was carrying with him on his trip to New Jersey. People just carried a lot of cash back in the day, didn't they? I guess paying with cards and just wasn't that common. $600? I don't think I've ever traveled with that much cash unless I've got a specific reason for traveling with that much cash. Then Aileen wrapped the victim's body in a sleeping bag, tossing it in either the backseat, the trunk, or both at some point in the evening. Again, Aileen couldn't remember, nor could she remember where she'd disposed of Seams's body or why she removed this particular corpse from the scene when she had left the previous victims lying where she'd killed them. Perhaps the area wasn't secluded enough. The next thing Aileen could clearly remember is that she'd arrived back in Daytona and climbed into bed with Tyrion Moore. They kept Seams's Pontiac Sunbird for nearly a month before they trashed it. The body of Peter Seams was never found. A pattern emerges. At this point, Aileen Wuornos had killed 4 men that we know of. The first victim, Richard Mallory, was back in December 1989. Then there was roughly a 6-month hiatus before Aileen suddenly started up again, killing her second victim in late May. The third and fourth victims were killed in early June within a matter of days of each other. The crash of the Pontiac Sunbird in front of multiple witnesses seems to have slowed things down a little, but only a little. As for what prompted Aileen to start a murder spree half a year after killing Richard Mallory, the reason is unclear. There is no definitive event in Aileen's life in the spring of 1990 that can be pinpointed as a psychological trigger. Aileen and Tyria weren't fighting any more than usual, and for the most part, things seemed to be settling down into a low-rent white trash status quo. One possible explanation for all the murders is Aileen's jealousy of the other women in Tyria's life. Sandy, Tyria's workmate from the Casa del Mar, was introduced to Aileen around the time of Mallory's murder in December. Tyria's half-sister, Tracy, arrived shortly before Aileen killed Spears in the spring. In the cold-blooded robbery school of thought, Aileen may have been driven by her mounting jealousy to rob these men and bring home some money so she could lavish it on Tyria. As it was, for years, Aileen spent the majority of her income from sex work on Tyria, while Tyria spent very little of her money on Aileen in return. It turns out that simping is not just the sole province of men. Aileen simped for Tyria. But Sandy was a constant in Tyria's life, so jealousy doesn't necessarily explain the hiatus between December 1989 and May 1990. This has led some people to speculate that there was something different about the murder of Richard Mallory. That Mallory was a rapist, school of thought asserts that Aileen killed him in self-defense and was traumatized. Then, after a period of shock, Aileen's deteriorating mental state and resentment of her male clients led her to kill the subsequent victims in cold blood. It's plausible, but it doesn't fully account for why Aileen, unaware she was being recorded, said to Nick Broomfield, a British documentarian, that, unquote, quote-unquote, some of the others were also in self-defense. In which case, which ones were the likely sexual assaulters? The man on his way to celebrate his daughter's graduation with the ex-wife he wanted to marry. The man on his way to pick up his fiancée. Or the married 65-year-old missionary on the way to visit his mother. It's possible that one or more of these men was a sexual predator, but it's equally as possible that none of these men even paid Aileen Wuornos for sex and had just offered her a ride. The alternate explanation, in the Mallory was a R-wordist school of thought, is that Aileen Wuornos, who had been sexually abused by her father from an early age, had experienced countless other traumas in addition to being a violent drunk with anger issues, was so traumatized by what happened with Richard Mallory that in her drunken paranoia she genuinely believed that the other victims were going to attack her when they probably weren't. It's not like a firm grasp on reality was ever Aileen's strong suit, even when she was sober. Now, the final school of thought we'll simply call pure madness. And that's that Aileen didn't kill any of these middle-aged men for money or in self-defense, but was murdering them because they resembled her father. Again, this is entirely possible. That school of thought largely speaks for itself, and if it is true, then everything Aileen said off camera to Nick Broomfield was utter bull. And in eventually claiming to be a monster, Aileen Wuornos was more honest with the state of Florida, which fervently wanted to kill her, than she was with anyone who thought of her as a friend. The sausage salesman. Tony Eugene Burress was a 50-year-old salesman for the Gilchrist Sausage Company in Ocala, Florida. He also cleaned swimming pools for a property management company on the side. Burress had 2 adult daughters from his first marriage who had given him grandchildren. He also had 3 adult stepdaughters from his second marriage, which was still going strong after 16 years. He was last seen on July the 30th, 1990, driving his delivery truck to drop off sausages to merchants, restaurants, and grocery stores in the surrounding townships. He was due back at 4 p.m. When he didn't return, his manager, Mrs. Johnny Mae Thompson, called the Salt Springs grocery store, the last stop on his route, and found out that Burress had never arrived. She waited until 6 p.m., left him a note, and then went home. Somewhere along his journey, Tony Burress picked up Aileen Wuornos. According to Wuornos' initial story, she had offered Burress sex for money and was accepted. Somewhere near State Road 19, Wuornos had stripped naked and was awaiting for payment before going further. But Burress just took out a measly $10 bill and threw it at her, saying, "That is all you deserve, you." According to the story, Burress then threatened to rape her. And so, Aileen Wuornos took out a .22 caliber pistol and shot Burress through the heart, which pierced one of his arteries and then ricocheted into his left lung. Already mortally wounded, Burress managed to turn and stagger away from Wuornos, presumably trying to flee. She shot him in the back, with the bullet going through his spine. Tony Burress dropped down to the ground and died. Aileen Wuornos dragged the victim's body a little way into the woods, dumped it under a tree, and covered it with some vegetation. She did not steal the man's wedding ring or gold chain necklace. Aileen then climbed back into the delivery truck and stole $310 from the cash box of the cab, or $713 in modern money. She drove the delivery truck away, stopping to get dressed and throw Tony Burress's credit card and sales documentation underneath a tree just off the road. Aileen then drove the truck a little further down the road and ran out of gas, not being aware that the delivery truck had a second tank designed to make fuel stops less frequent. So she climbed out and abandoned it. She runs out of gas a lot. Eileen's not exactly the biggest attention payer in the world, is she? Tony Burress was reported missing to the Marion County Sheriff's Office by his second wife, Sharon, at 2 a.m. on July the 31st. 2 hours later, a sheriff's deputy located Burress's delivery truck on State Road 19. The truck was unfortunately returned to Gilchrist Sausage Company, where the mobile crime scene was contaminated by Gilchrist management staff. Meanwhile, at sunrise, a horseback search party and helicopter were called in to comb the woods for Burress. The search came up empty-handed and was suspended at 11 p.m. at night. What are those guys doing? It's like, oh yeah, we found his abandoned car. We'll just take it back to the company. They need to get their sausages delivered places. It's like, yo, how about the missing dude's car? We comb for evidence. Like, what the? This is the 90s. This is a thing. 3 days later, in the afternoon of August the 4th, a family was having a picnic in Ocala National Park when the children curiously followed a large trail of ants going into the brush underneath a tree. Oh no. This is how they discovered Troy Burress's body, roughly 8 miles from where the delivery truck had been found. Initially, the prime suspect had been a male drifter named Curtis Blankenship, who had been seen hitchhiking near the abandoned truck on the evening of July the 30th. Blankenship had shown his driver's license to stay at a local campsite nearby. The next day, he'd stolen a pickup truck and driven it from Florida to Indiana. Police tracked him down and arrested him on August the 8th. Investigators could not find any of Blankenship's prints in the delivery truck or anything else tying him to it. There was also no evidence that a suspect had ever come into possession of a .22 caliber pistol. After a month of questioning, police were forced to cut Blankenship loose. Once again, Aileen Wuornos was not on the list of suspects. Furthermore, Florida law enforcement in their various jurisdictions had not yet connected the 4 murders and the missing presumed dead case of Peter Seams together. It's crazy how they never... This is in the 90s, and they're still not talking to each other. We began to say things like, oh yeah, she just went to a different state, and that solved all of her legal problems. It's like, you're in the same country. It's not like you fled to, like, Belize or some shit. Despite the fact that the victims were murdered with a .22, and there were similarities in the dumping of the bodies and the abandonment of the vehicles elsewhere, each case continued to be investigated separately, and here are some words that I like to read, but not for long. In August 1990, Aileen and Tyra were evicted from their apartment. Aileen had been verbally abusive to her landlady multiple times. What a surprise. Had cussed out her 15-year-old son, had been blasting the stereo late at night, and thrown a bunch of firecrackers outside the apartment window while cackling drunkenly. Tyra approached her co-worker at the Casa del Mar, Alzada Sherman, and spun her a story about how Aileen was leaving for Las Vegas, so Tyra needed a place to stay. Tyra promised to pay rent. Also, Tyra asked could Aileen stay with them until she departed. Sherman agreed, albeit reluctantly, about Aileen staying, but she consoled herself that it would only be temporary. I get the feeling it's not going to be so temporary. Of course, the whole Las Vegas story was bullshit. What a shocking surprise, and Aileen started staying there as well, leaving for a few days at a time, only to then return. Sherman was not aware Aileen worked as a roadside sex worker, and went on record expressing her astonishment at that fact when she found out. According to Alzada Sherman, she couldn't believe that, quote, any man would want Aileen, much less pay for her. She was ugly and didn't bathe. And tell it like it is, Sherman. Jesus. Despite getting rid of Aileen without sparking one of her tantrums, Alzada Sherman lied to Tyria and Aileen that having 2 roommates in her apartment broke the terms of her lease and she couldn't risk getting evicted. Accordingly, Aileen and Tyria moved out on the 27th of August 1990 into another cheap motel in Daytona called Happy Holidays. On December the 1st, 1990, Aileen tried to call Tyria at work at the Casa del Mar Hotel. She was informed by the bellman who answered the phone that employees weren't allowed to take personal calls. Eileen flew into her usual profanity-laced invective and the bellman hung up on her. Eileen called a second time to tell the bellman that she was coming over to the hotel to beat the shit out of him. The bellman hung up again. He was like, yes, but great thing about the telephone is I can just end this conversation. Goodbye. Legend. Eileen called a third time. The bellman gave up and put Eileen through to the laundry room. Oh, bellman, you were such a legend. And now you're just like, oh, okay, fine. Third time's the charm. You've been so abusive that I'll let you get your way. I'll be like, chick, 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 chick. Lift it up, put it down. Although, I mean, the bellman doesn't know that she's an actual murderer. If I did know that it was actually a murderer, I'd be like, okay, I'm going to get a new job somewhere else, just in case. After Eileen told Tyria what had happened, Tyria came out of the laundry room and started shouting at the bellman, threatening him with violence for the heinous crime of hanging up on her girlfriends. The bellman made a complaint to the management. Yes, good for you. Someone's getting fired. Tyria took the day off work, but showed up to the staff barbecue on September the 3rd, where she got stinking drunk. Oh, don't get too drunk at the company barbecue. That's not get drunk at your barbecue with your friends, not with your work colleagues. It's a bad idea. And it often happens. People are like, oh, I got really drunk at the work doing it. It's like, that is not a good look. Don't do that. She was approached by a hotel supervisor who'd asked about a fight with the bellman. Tyria started shouting at the supervisor. Uh-oh. Then the bellman showed up. Uh-oh. Tyria started shouting at him too. Eventually, the supervisor had had enough and told Tyria she was fired. In response, Tyria attacked the hotel supervisor, pinning him against the wall and punching him repeatedly in the face. Oh my lord, you've just escalated getting fired to criminal charges. Over the next few days, Tyria pleaded with upper management not to fire her. When that didn't work, you beat the out of your boss. What did you expect? She threatened to sue the hotel and the supervisor, whom she'd beaten up on the grounds of sexual harassment. When that didn't work, Tyria started phoning in death threats to the supervisor. He responded by putting in a police complaint. Excellent. It sounds like this supervisor is doing everything the correct way. A week later, the supervisor put in a second complaint when a rumor circulated that Tyria and Aileen had put out a hit on him. What? If this incident demonstrates one thing, it wasn't just Aileen who had a volatile temper, a penchant for violence, and the willingness to use death threats at the slightest provocation. Yeah, we know that because Tyria and Aileen physically fought each other regularly. It's worth pointing out at this juncture that it is a matter of official court record that Tyria Moore was aware Aileen was killing people. Oh, okay. But she told people that she was too scared of Aileen to leave her or to report her to the authorities. This claim is coming from a rather sturdy woman who could beat up a 140-pound male supervisor and was known to have engaged regularly in drunken physical altercations with Aileen and frequently managed to win. To this day, the extent of Tyria Moore's involvement in any of the murders is unknown. Meanwhile, Tyria and Eileen's relationship was breaking down. Tyria started talking about moving back to stay with her family in Ohio. She even went as far to privately tell the management at the Happy Holidays motel that those were her plans. Cartwheeling next to the abyss. On September the 11th, 1990, 56-year-old Charles Richard Dick Humphreys had his last day of work as supervising investigator for child abuse cases at the Office of Health and Rehabilitation Services in Sumterville, Florida. I feel bad for emphasizing Dick. This guy's obviously going to be the good guy of the story. David put it like Richard Dick Humphreys. I apologize, Dick. My uncle's called Dick. It's funny though, Dick. A former Air Force major and also former chief of police in Arkansas, Dick Humphreys had spent a year helping victims of child abuse in Sumterville and had just been transferred to work in the state office in Ocala. Humphreys lived in Crystal River on the Florida coast with his wife Shirley. They had just celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary the day before. At 3 p.m. on the 11th, Humphreys drove his 1985 Oldsmobile Frenzer from the police office to pay a visit to Gold Goodwins, whose ex-husband he had previously investigated for child abuse. The ex-husband was arrested, and since then, Humphreys and Gail had become friends. The Humphreys drove to Wildwood Police Station to discuss the autopsy of a 10-year-old boy. The grim inquiry only took a few minutes, and Humphreys left. At 4 p.m., Humphreys spotted another young boy alone in a car at the Journey's End Motel. After observing the boy and waiting for someone to come and get him, Humphreys went into the motel office to inquire. There he found the boy's mother and told him to go and collect him, and that he shouldn't be left out in the car unattended.
Humphreys then departed and drove a short distance to a convenience store where he bought a 6-pack of beer. He left via State Road 44, headed in the direction of the I-75, which would have led him home. Oh no. This guy's going to become a victim, isn't he? I thought he was going to be like the guy who blows the case wide open or something. Like he's a supervising investigator for child abuses. Isn't this our hero? But he's just going to be a victim. And this sounds like such a good guy. He's just chilling with his beer and he's sticking his head into someone's business, like about the child, like in a good way, being like, you shouldn't leave your kid in the car. And that woman's probably like, mind your own business. And it's like, excuse me, I'm like a child abuse investigator. So maybe you should shut the up and go get your kid from the car. All right. Legend. Dick Humphreys picked up Aileen Wuornos somewhere on the I-75. According to Wuornos, she offered him sex and he accepted. They pulled off the I-75 and drove into the woods near Marion Oaks. There, the two of them exited the vehicle. Humphreys was still fully clothed, and Wuornos shot him once in the stomach, once in the arm, 4 times in the chest. And while Humphreys lay dying on the ground, she shot him once in the head, behind his left ear, killing him instantly. Aileen stole the victim's wallet, contained $130, $300 in today's money, but she did not steal his wedding ring or his watch. She got back into the Oldsmobile and drove it back to the Happy Holidays motel. Because Aileen considered Humphreys a cop, she intended to keep all of his personal effects, his business papers, and his Arkansas police badge as trophies. Don't keep trophies! That's a bad idea.
Sweet, but completely unnecessary.
Dick Humphreys' body was discovered the following evening at 8 p.m. on September the 12th by 2 boys from a nearby neighborhood in Marion Oaks. The story made the news, and an appeal for information went out to anyone who had seen Humphreys or the blue Oldsmobile that he had been driving after 4 p.m. on September the 11th. They even showed a picture of the car. Aileen and Tyria caught the news broadcast and reacted with no little alarm. The victim's Oldsmobile had been parked out front of their motel for the last 24 hours. I don't understand. How have you been such a criminal for so long? You've just murdered someone. You've taken their car and you've parked it outside your house for a day. Are you crazy? This is actual craziness. Aileen gathered all her trophies and got into the Oldsmobile. She drove down the highway, stopping to throw Humphreys' wallet and Arkansas police badge into some nearby bushes. Then Aileen traveled southwest for 90 minutes to a quiet area called Boggy Marsh Road. There she tossed out all of Humphreys' files and papers and anything that could link the car to the victim, throwing everything from the moving vehicle. Half an hour later, she pulled over and ripped off the license plate and removed a Highway Patrol Association bumper sticker, which she peeled off the car with her fingernails, tossing them both into the brush by the road. God, have you not heard of burning shit? Like papers? You just burn it. Burn it in the sink in the motel. What are you doing this? Then she drove the car 2.5 hours north to Live Oak, where she used some Windex to wipe down the car for her fingerprints. She concealed the car behind an abandoned gas station along the I-10, and with the job done, Aileen hitchhiked her way home. Job is not done. Why are you not setting the car on fire? Why aren't you burning things? I don't understand. Why? You must know that burning things is an excellent way to get rid of evidence. Come on now. Dick Humphreys' elderly wife, Shirley, later told the news, her tone dripping with venom, that she hoped Aileen Wuornos would get to meet Old Sparky, which is early 20th century slang for the electric chair. Oh, I know that, David. Old Sparky. It's where she belongs!
Strap her to the chair!
Hi. What happened to you?
Meanwhile, the Florida police from their various jurisdictions were talking to each other about their open murder cases and were finally putting the puzzle pieces together. Both David Spears and their John Doe, identified in December as Charles Cascadden, had been found naked in the woods and shot with a .22 caliber pistol. Their vehicles had been stolen and later dumped at a separate location. Troy Barres was not found naked, but he was killed with a .22, and his vehicle was found 8 miles down the road from where his body was dumped. The similarities were enough to include Barres in the investigation. Excellent. The officers first met on September the 6th. During the meeting, they just happened to examine the file of the missing, presumed dead Peter Seams. His car was found nearly a month after his disappearance, being driven, crashed, and abandoned by 2 heavily intoxicated women. The interior of the car and the trunk was stained with a large amount of dried blood. Yes, I remember it well. The trunk. It's like, there was a body in there, wasn't there? It's like the accident was so bad, somehow blood got in the boot. It's like, no. And it's days old. There was a body in there. Come on now. Let's test that blood. Multiple witnesses had spoken to the women, and the sheriff had circulated sketches of them both to other agencies. What struck the investigators was how similar one of the women looked to the male Curtis Blankenship, who had been suspected in the murder of Troy Barres. Blankenship had been seen hitchhiking near Barres' delivery truck. But what if there had been another person hitchhiking near the delivery truck who matched his description? And what if that suspect was a woman? On September the 11th, investigators interviewed Orange Springs volunteer fire chief Hubert Hewitt and his wife Brenda. Oh,
I feel like we came across these people before, but I forgotten what they did. They wanted to make absolutely sure that one of the women, the thinner, light brown-haired one, was in fact a woman. Mr. Hewitt replied the affirmative. He had, quote, seen the outline of her bra underneath her shirt. Ron's Bailey, who had witnessed the crash of Peter Seams's Pontiac Sunbird, said much the same thing. 2 drunken women. Yeah, so I think this was the fire chief. Oh, it says right there, fire chief. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't tying it together. I was like, different fire chief. But this was the fire chief who drove his car out and checked on them. Sorry, I have a small brain. There's a lot of characters in today's episode, to be honest. On September the 12th, the body of Dick Humphreys was found near Marion Oaks. He had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol, his vehicle had been stolen, and he'd been left fully clothed, just like Troy Barres. That clinched it. These murders seemed likely to have been committed by the same perp. Additionally, all 5 cases they had so far linked together had the same victim profile. Middle-aged white men between the ages of 40 and 65. To this growing list of connections was erroneously added the case of Douglas Giddens, whose body had been dumped in a similar style with his car stolen, but he had only been shot once with a .38. On September the 17th, investigators from all 6 cases met at the Marion County Sheriff's Office. The gathered officers agreed, surprisingly quickly given the paucity of evidence, that the 2 women are their most likely suspects. The Peter Seams case was the only one that directly pointed toward this. However, a .22 caliber pistol is the most frequent firearm used by women due to its gentler recoil. Yeah, 22 bullets are very small. I was like, really? People getting killed by 22s? And then apparently, like, one of the things about them, like someone commented in the comments, was that on YouTube, is that if you get shot by one, they don't have enough velocity to exit. So they'll often just like enter you and then rattle around and bump off your bones or your skull, and can be very deadly rather than like a through and through, which can be less deadly. Fascinating. And female hitchhikers might be more likely to be picked up by a skeptical man, especially since one of the victims, David Spears, was said to be extremely wary of hitchhikers and would not pick them up. Finally, all the victims' cars were found with the driver's seat pushed all the way forward, implying the driver was short. Aileen was 5'5". Meanwhile, all the victims' heights were between 5'10" and 6'5". By the 17th, Dick Humphrey's work papers and other possessions had been found on Boggy Marsh Road. What was interesting about this was how they were scattered on both sides of the road, implying that 2 people had thrown them out of both sides of the window. If true, this might also imply, allegedly, that Tyrion Moore was allegedly with Aileen Wuornos when she disposed of the Humphreys' evidence, allegedly, and may well have allegedly taken part in other stages of the murders. Allegedly. Yeah, because I think David mentioned earlier, she's never been proven to be actively involved with it. I think she admitted that she knew about it but was scared, but obviously, allegedly, all of this is alleged. It's just David's speculation. And my speculation is that I absolutely agree with David, allegedly. The conclusions the investigators drew from this meeting were, 1, they needed to set up a centralized task force to link the investigations into all these cases, and 2, it seemed increasingly probable that they had 1 or 2 female serial killers on their hands. None of the investigators in the room had ever heard of such a thing before. As such, they consulted with criminal profilers at the FBI, who, after a brief review of the case files, agreed. Police began searching the archives for women with criminal records and perhaps a history of being ticketed for hitchhiking along the interstate highways. A press release went out seeking 2 females in connection with a series of murders. The media wasted no time in dubbing the women the angels of death, despite the fact that the term is usually reserved for doctors or nurses who kill their patients, and there was nothing particularly angelic about Aileen Wuornos and Tyrion Moore. Yeah, I don't know, they always like serial killers, let's give them a cool name. And there's that tired old joke, it's just like, let's give the small penis killer, or whatever. It would be much more appropriate. Or the unbathed female killer, also slightly ugly.
A new marketing campaign.
But the very whiff of something as quote-unquote as unique and sexy as 2 female serial killers caused various members of the media and entertainment industry to sit up and pay attention, their nostrils positively a-quiver. That's unpleasant, isn't it? What's great is this sexy story, female serial killers. How about, for a moment, you think about the people who've been murdered by them in cold blood? Maybe, media, come on now. Everyone knew that when 2 women were caught, it was going to be a huge story. There was money to be made, a great deal of money. The mercurial contagion even spread to some of the police officers working the case. It later came out that some of them began private talks with true crime authors, TV networks, and Hollywood studios about lending their names and expertise to potentially lucrative projects in utter violation of protocol, I might add. Yeah, how about you don't do that, police? That's I don't know what the protocol is there, but it's like, no, you can't be doing that. On September the 19th, police found Dick Humphrey's Oldsmobile concealed behind an abandoned gas station on the I-10. They were disappointed to discover that the car had been wiped of prints. All they found was a receipt for beer from a store in Wildwood. 2 days later, an Investigators added the case of Richard Mallory, who had been murdered the previous year on December 1st, 1989, to their growing list of victims. He too had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol, dumped in the woods, and his car stolen. Eileen did not know it yet, but she was living on borrowed time. The fetal position. On September the 29th, 1990, Aileen and Tyria left the Happy Holidays motel without paying their bill. Shocking. When the manager tried to stop them, Aileen threatened him with violence. They checked in at the nearby Fairview motel, with Aileen signing under the name Cammy Green. Tyria was unemployed and spent her days lazing around in the room. Aileen went out on the road hooking to make them money. When the owner asked Tyria what Aileen did, Tyria aggressively told her not to ask about their private business. The revenue from the sex work seemed to be drying up, and Aileen was having difficulty paying the $100 per week to stay at the Fairview, $230 in today's money. So Aileen and Tyria went to Vera and Velmir Ivakovic, Yugoslav restaurant owners whom Aileen had befriended in the early 80s. Aileen spun some bullshit story about them losing their pressure cleaning business and falling on hard times. Vera and Velmir kindly allowed them to move in for $50 a week. They spent most of their time holed up in the bedroom watching TV, smoking and drinking heavily. Some days Aileen and Tyria would get through 48 cans of beer between them. Good lord, that is like 2 pallets, 2 of those big crates. That's a lot of beer. That's 2 beers an hour, 24 hours a day. Jesus. On October the 23rd, police chased up on the receipt for beer from a store in Wildwood and found Dick Humphrey's car. The store in question was just across the street from the motel where Humphreys was last seen around 4 p.m. The store clerk, Anita Armstrong, did not recognize Dick Humphrey's picture, but said it was plausible that he'd been there at 4 or 5 p.m. on September the 11th buying beer. More helpfully, Armstrong recalled 2 women walking through the store around that time who matched the police sketches of the suspect. Armstrong distinctly remembered the women not buying anything. If Armstrong's testimony is accurate, it would mean Tyria Moore was allegedly with Aileen Wuornos just prior to the murder of Dick Humphreys. And it was even possible, allegedly and hypothetically, that Dick Humphreys gave a ride to not 1, but to 2 women that day. While at Vera Velimir's place, Aileen and Tyria racked up a debt of $230 in rent and meals, or $530 in modern money. They always seemed to have money for booze, though. After a few nasty confrontations, they were thrown out of the Ivakovic's place on November the 17th. They went back to the Fairview Motel and begged to stay there again, claiming poverty and saying that they'd get some money soon. They were permitted to return. As before, Aileen signed in using the stolen driver's license of Cammy Green. The 2 women told the manager that Tyria was going to fly to Ohio that day and spend Thanksgiving with her family. Aileen, meanwhile, was headed to Orlando for a couple of days to do a pressure cleaning job, after which she'd be able to pay the manager some money. The manager saw the 2 women leave the Fairview together later that day. Tyria flew from Dayton to Ohio, while Aileen prepared to spend Thanksgiving alone. That night, Aileen got very drunk and went hitchhiking. She was picked up by Walter Antonio, a 62-year-old truck driver who also moonlighted as a security guard and reserve police officer. He had a fiancée. Antonio was driving his maroon Pontiac Grand Prix down to Alabama, where he'd pick up a semi-truck and a shipment. Aileen claims he negotiated a price for sex, and they turned onto a dirt road in the woods 9 miles north of Cross City in Dixie County, northern Florida. According to Aileen's initial testimony, after they stopped and got naked, Walter Antonio pulled out his reserve police badge and threatened to arrest Aileen if she didn't have sex with him for free. Well, how do you think that's going to What? It's like, yo, what? Like, you're getting yourself in trouble as well at the same time. They argued, struggled, and Aileen pulled out her .22. She shot Antonio twice in the back, possibly while he was trying to flee, and once in the back of the head, going through the top of his skull, but not killing him. Aileen then shot Antonio once more in the back while he was already collapsed on the ground. Still alive, Antonio curled up in the fetal position and slowly bled to death. Without waiting for him to expire, Aileen emptied the victim's wallet and wrenched a gold and diamond ring off his finger. She then headed to his car, from which she tossed some of the victim's belongings into the woods. Aileen later asked police if Walter Antonio had survived. Of course he hadn't, was the answer. She had left him mortally wounded on a dirt road at night in the middle of nowhere. Aileen then drove the car 2.5 hours southeast across the Floridian Peninsula to Daytona Beach. Along the way, she tossed out even more of the victim's possessions. She parked the Grand Prix in front of her room at the Fairview Motel and told the manager that it was her boyfriend's car. Meanwhile, Aileen paid the manager with some of the money that she'd looted from the victim. Again, you're stealing your victims' cars, your murder victims' cars, and just parking them outside your house. What are you up to? On November the 19th, Walter Antonio's body was found lying in a dirt road in Dixie County, still in the fetal position. The murder weapon was identified as a .22 pistol. Ballistics would later link the bullets from all of the bodies to the same gun. Given Antonio had been shot 3 times in the back and once more in the back of the head, it is difficult to imagine how these wounds could have been inflicted in self-defense. On November the 24th, Antonio's Grand Prix was discovered 200 miles to the south, having been abandoned in Brevard County. Antonio had kept track of his car's mileage in a little notebook found in the vehicle. This allowed police to determine that the car had been driven roughly 1,000 miles in the week since Antonio had gone missing. Apparently, the killer had been doing a little joyriding before dumping it. Due to the identical MO of dumping the body, stealing the car, and later dumping the vehicle at a second location, and also the murder weapon being a .22 pistol, police connected Walter Antonio's death to the other cases immediately. At this point, Aileen had killed at least 7 victims. The Secret Life of Cammy Green. On November the 25th, Aileen hitched a ride with one of her drinking buddies, Donald Willingham, to Daytona Airport to pick up Tyria, who was returning from Ohio. Willingham drove the 2 women back to the Fairview Motel, making a pit stop for a case of beer. Once Willingham had dropped them off and the women were alone in their room, Aileen presented Tyria with the gold and diamond ring that she'd ripped off a dying man's finger. Oh, what a charming gift. Tyria put it on, but the romantic bliss didn't last long. 4 days later, on November the 29th, Tyria called her mother in Ohio and asked her to wire some money. Tyria said she was going to use it to purchase a bus ticket home. The next day, on November the 30th, police were contacted by Billy and Cindy Copeland, who lived in a trailer park just north of Tampa. They recognized the police sketches of the 2 women from the news. Billy and Cindy identified the women as Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore, who had lived next door to them at the trailer park from January 1989 until October of that year. Billy and Cindy Copeland also recognized a picture of the first victim, Richard Mallory, identifying him as a regular John who occasionally visited Aileen and Tyria's trailer. Once they had seen him carrying a TV as a gift. Oh yeah, God, it was many hours ago, wasn't it? The gifting, it's like, yeah, come back to my place and I'll give you a TV. Ugh. The Copelands even went as far as to claim they heard Aileen and Tyria refer to him as Mallory. The witness testimony had never been corroborated, but if true, it would mean that Richard Mallory was known to Aileen and likely had paid her for sex several times in the months prior to his murder. Perhaps Mallory and Aileen had even arranged to travel from Tampa to Daytona Beach together on the night of November the 30th, 1989, or perhaps Mallory simply saw Aileen hooking by the side of the road and recognized her. As for Aileen, she always maintained that she met Mallory for the first time on the night she killed him. Uh-oh, story's falling apart. At any rate, this was the first time Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore were brought to the attention of the police in connection with the murders. The cops did not act on the information immediately because it was just one lead among approximately 400 tips that they received. Yeah, I mean, you can't blame them. I mean, it is like, in a way, the craziest thing is that the police didn't talk to each other and the states don't talk to each other and they're not linking all these things together. But there's a lot of leads and there's a lot of bad people out there. But I don't know. I feel like they should have been caught by now because they're so sloppy. On December the 2nd, 1990, Tyria and Aileen announced to a few acquaintances that they'd broken up and Tyria was moving back to Ohio. Some witnesses claimed that the women did not seem particularly upset about it. They moved out of the Fairview Motel and, with another ride from Donald Willingham, Tyria and Aileen took their belongings to a storage locker that Aileen had rented. The 2 women peaceably loaded the storage locker together without argument or incident. Amid their possessions were several items that Aileen had looted from the victims. On December the 3rd, Willingham drove Tyria and Aileen to the Greyhound station where Aileen walked Tyria to her bus and said goodbye. If you subscribe to the cold-blooded robbery school of thought, which, personally, I think I do, where Aileen committed the murders to lavish money on Tyria, then the reason why all those men died had just boarded a bus to Ohio. Climbing back into Donald Willingham. I also think she murdered people because she's a psycho.
I never hated men, but now I do.
It wasn't just to rob them. I think she probably liked killing. Climbing back into Donald Willingham's car, Aileen cracked open a beer, started chugging it, and then began to cry. They drove back to Willingham's apartment where Donald and Aileen had sex. Because Donald had been giving Aileen free rides the past few days, she didn't charge him. After spending the night, however, Aileen did ask Willingham for a loan. He said he had no money and was already behind on his rent. The next morning, Willingham dropped Aileen off in downtown Daytona. He later discovered Aileen had stolen some of his clothes. That's desperate, isn't it? Clothes don't exactly have a big resale value. On December the 5th, Aileen returned to the Fairview Motel again and begged for another room. Using the alias of Cammy Green, she stayed until December the 10th, not being able to pay the final $20 on her bill, but leaving a gold ring as collateral. On December the 11th, Aileen made her way 105 miles south of the tiny hamlet of Miko, where she met a bartender, Virginia Rocco. Aileen attempted to trade men's jewelry in exchange for booze. Then, after knowing Aileen all of 20 minutes and listening to her sob stories, Rocco agreed to let Aileen stay the night in her cabin in the woods. Okay. Wouldn't be a murder story without a cabin in the woods, would it? While staying at the cabin, Aileen stole a bunch of jewelry and Virginia Rocco's driver's license, passport, and even birth certificate. She did, however, leave Rocco a thank you note on the coffee table when she left. Hey Rocco, thanks for the identity. I hope it doesn't screw with your life too much, Rocco. Bye. What the f***, Aileen, you piece of shit. What's weird is I have so much sympathy. I know the people that she rips off aren't the people that she's murdering, but it's these are just good people who are oh, I feel sorry for you. Let me help you out. And then just get totally ripped off. It just feels so f*** off. On December the 13th, the owner of the Pierre Motel called the police and told them that the two women they were seeking had stayed at the motel for several months in 1986 and 1987, and again in 1988. How would you remember this? The owner of the I guess they'd really stick in your mind because they seem to be pretty wild. But that's it was years ago. And they remember them? Oh yeah, they used to stay with us. I guess you don't really forget a face, do you? But that still impresses me, okay. One of the women, who the owner identified as Tyria Moore, had even worked as a maid there. Oh, okay, there you go. The owner identified the other woman as Susan Blahavets, the alias which Aileen had signed in the register. On December the 14th, an anonymous tipster claimed to the police that Tyria Moore was one of the women they were looking for and gave them the phone number of Moore's parents in Ohio. Police did not call the number at the time, in case it rattled her and she went into hiding. A fourth tip filtered in the same day from a tour bus driver, Paul Gribbins, whom Aileen had drunkenly threatened with violence in a bar back in 1987. He was only able to identify Aileen and Tyria by their first names. People have amazing memories. It's always do you remember that person you met once in a bar 4 years ago who got a bit leery? I'll be yeah? Do you remember what they look like? No. Do you remember their name? I don't remember my friends' names. What? Come on. Do I have a terrible memory, or do these people seem to have incredible memories? I'm joking. I do remember my friends' names.
Neighbor, man, it is the least you can do.
But when I meet someone for the first time, it does take me a while. Because apparently, when you meet someone, you're so focused on remembering all the other stuff about them, like what they do, where they're from, blah, 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 that you forget their names. And so I try really hard to remember people's names, and I really still suck at it. People are I'll just try this memory trick with the names. And I'm yeah, it doesn't work. Still at it. On December the 20th, a private detective in Port Orange called, saying his confidential informant claimed that, quote-unquote, Lee and Ty lived at the Fairview Motel. Although the police had been flooded with calls falsely accusing various women, the fact that 5 tips had been called in about Aileen and Tyria put them very near the top of the list of suspects. Tyria Moore's name was provided in full by 2 of the tipsters. Police ran a background check on her and got a copy of her fingerprints, but they had not, as yet, identified the mysterious Lee. Aileen. Okay, gotcha. I was I just thought it was an alias, but it's a short version of her name. Okay. On December the 21st, police called the owner of the Fairview Motel, asking if Tyria Moore and another woman were staying there. The owner said they'd left recently. The owner explained that Tyria Moore and a woman who signed in as Cammie Green had stayed there on 2 separate occasions. Then Cammie Green had stayed a third and final time on her own, departing just 11 days earlier. The owner also explained how, on the morning of November the 18th, Cammie Green had parked a maroon Pontiac Grand Prix at the Fairview Motel, saying it was her boyfriend's, and she also paid the owner a large amount of cash toward her stay. Uh-oh. That's what happens when you drive your murder victims' cars and park them outside your house. This potentially connected the woman named Cammie, aka Susan, aka Lee, to the murder of Walter Antonio, who had been killed on the night of the 17th and 18th, and whose Grand Prix was found abandoned on the 24th, miles away at a second location. Given that all the victims had money and numerous possessions stolen, it occurred to investigators that the 2 women may have pawned some of the looted items for cash. As such, the police went round to pawn shops in Daytona looking for a Cammie Green in their sales records. Why would you give the same name? If they're not asking for ID, just be yeah, John. Jane Smith. Jane Smith at the pawn shops me. Hey, Jane Smith. As soon as you go to a sketchy pawn shop, they're all right, Jane. All right, Miss Smith. Miss Blogs, Miss Doe, here's your money. And I'll give you a very bad rate for that gold, which I'm going to melt down. Pawn shop owners are required by law to keep such records. Okay, fine. There we go. That makes tons of sense, because otherwise they're just going to be like a hotbed for stolen merchandise. Cammie Green came up twice in the search. Once was in the June 1990 sale of a box of tools that matched the descriptions of ones usually carried by David Spears, the second victim. The other came from the OK Pawn Shop, where on December the 6th, 1989, Cammie Green had pawned a camera and a police radar detector. Richard Mallory's ex-girlfriend, Jackie Davis, had informed police back in December 1989 that his radar detector was missing from his personal effects in his car. Nor could police find the radar detector at his electronics store, in his company vans, or at his apartment. The fact that Cammie Green had pawned a police radar detector of the same make and model a week after Richard Mallory's disappearance confirmed to police that the so-called Cammie Green was the woman they were looking for. Yeah, no
There's enough evidence there to be like, all right, we need that Cammy. Let's go. But it got even better. It doesn't need to get better. You've got enough, police. Go, go, go. Find Cammy. Arrest her. Strap her to the chair. But it got even better. In Volusia County, where the OK pawn shop was located, there's a law which requires pawn shop owners, yes, I remember this, to take a thumbprint from everyone who sells something at their store. And in exchange for $30, the mysterious Cammy Green had left just such a thumbprint. Police looked for a match which involved going through hundreds of older cards, not yet electronically uploaded to the police database. On the morning of December the 22nd, the thumbprint was matched to Laurie Grody, who was charged with car theft and resisting arrest in January 1986, and in a different county for carrying a concealed weapon in 1986. Both times, she had failed to appear in court. Yeah, because she just gave them a fake name, and for some reason they gave her bail. It's like you have no idea who she is. I feel like if I got arrested, they'd be like, all right, we need some ID. And I'll be like, I don't have any ID. And then I'm like, well, you're not leaving then, are you? Because we need to know where you are if we're going to say, oh yeah, just give us some money and you can bugger off. Because that's insane, police. What are you up to? Matching the thumbprint to the arrest prints of Laurie Grody gave police access to the rest of the print impressions taken from both of Grody's hands. The prints from Laurie Grody's palms were quickly matched to the partial palm print found on the door handle of the car belonging to Peter Seams, which two women had drunkenly abandoned on July the 4th. Everything is being tied together so nicely, albeit many deaths and years later. After a few more hours, those prints were also matched to one Aileen Wuornos, yes, who had been arrested for several vehicle and firearm offences in the 1970s. Let's go! And who in 1981 had gone to jail for armed robbery of a convenience store. Police reissued the outstanding warrant from June 1986 for Laurie Grody, citing her failure to appear in court in regard to the concealed weapon charge. But this time, they listed all of Grody's other aliases. I guess at this point, they don't know that Aileen Wuornos is the actual name of her. That could just be another alias, couldn't it? On the evening of the 22nd, police were dispatched to talk to the real Cammy Green, mother of two sons, wife of Dinky Green, who had rented a room to Tyria Moore for several years and had twice played hostess to her girlfriend Aileen Wuornos. Green was naturally shocked that Tyria and Aileen were wrapped up in a murder case. Yeah, even if someone's like dodgy and sketchy and threatened you with violence, you'd be like, really? Murder? Holy shit, that's a step up from like just regular shit. Like, I don't know anyone who's been murdered or murdered anyone. That's like that, which implies it doesn't happen very often. She said that her driver's license had disappeared the second time Aileen and Tyria had stayed there. Green also... Don't they have pictures on driving licenses? Did you just happen to look enough like all of these people? Green also related to the police that she thought Aileen was a roadside sex worker and that she'd once talked about her idea of killing men who pick up prostitutes and stealing their money, thereby, quote, doing society a favor. If you're actually doing that... Don't talk about that. Meanwhile, police officers were dispatched to the Fairview Motel to pick up a few photographs that the owner had found of Tyria and Aileen. Having some actual photos rather than just sketches would be useful in tracking the women down, but for now, police halted any further witness inquiries. They did not want word to get back to Wuornos and Moore, and that they were prime suspects, prompting the women to flee. On December the 18th, 1990, Aileen Wuornos was getting trashed at Wet Willie's, a dive bar in downtown Daytona. She began drinking with a man named Dick Mills, a recently divorced Army veteran in his mid-40s. They went back to Mills's apartment together and spent the next few days in each other's company, drinking and frequently having sex. Aileen did not charge Mills for the sex and appears to have been just seeking some companionship. Dick Mills later sold his story to the News of the World. The News of the World. Classy. Allegedly, Aileen Wuornos told Dick Mills about one of her sexual fantasies. To quote the newspaper article in question, she said she often got turned on by imagining she had a black hood over her head and she was tied to a tree in a forest. Then a guy would come up, arm at her, and shoot her in the head. She said the actual killing would make her climax. Well, no, the actual killing would make you dead. Mills later denied that she made those precise remarks, but said that they were partially true and that Aileen would fantasize about sleeping in a cabin in the woods, having a man crawl through the window and, quote, he would R-word her and this and that kind of and she liked that. After a few days, on December the 24th, Mills took Aileen to a Christmas party attended by members of his family. Aileen proceeded to get drunk and regale the Mills family about her time in jail, her drug use, and how she had been abused as a child. One of Mills's daughters quietly told Dick to get Aileen out of there and never bring her back. Mills drove Aileen to the Hawaii Motel in Daytona, gave her $50 and said goodbye and good luck. Mills would later say about the week they spent together, it was just another bad experience, I'm sure, for the both of us.
The Y Motel was on Ridgewood Avenue, the wrong side of the tracks in Daytona, where homeless people, drunks, drug addicts, and sex workers were all in abundance. Evidently, there were so many sex workers down there so desperate for their next fix that $2 blowjobs were on offer. On the way down Ridgewood Avenue was the Last Resort Biker Bar, where Aileen dropped in half a dozen times to drink, talk, and play pool. It was a rough place, full of some shady characters, but Aileen knew how to tell a funny story and was generally tolerated, if not well liked. By late December, the Florida police had obtained flight records of Tyria Moore's trip to Cadiz, Ohio in November to spend Thanksgiving with her family. This provided Moore with an alibi for the murder of Walter Antonio and implied that Aileen Wuornos had done at least one of the murders solo. Combined with the fact that it was Eileen's thumbprint on the pawned items and not Tyria's, police began to think that Aileen was the major person of interest rather than there being a serial killer duo. That said, Tyria had been seen fleeing Peter Seams's car on the 4th of July, and a woman who matched her description was also seen in Wildwood just prior to the murder of Dick Humphreys. As such, the extent of Tyria's involvement in the murders remained unclear. Police also discovered, at the start of December, Moore had returned to Cadiz, Ohio. On December the 26th, 2 senior officers were dispatched to Cadiz to find her. That would be a sensitive operation. They did not yet have enough evidence to arrest Moore for murder. And if police approached her and questioned her about the murders, she might tip off Aileen, who might flee or go into hiding. Are the police is it really impossible to find someone like this? I thought, isn't it true that if someone escapes from prison, aren't they always captured within 24 hours because there's a big manhunt? How hard is it to find someone? Be like, okay, well, she doesn't have a passport. Put in all the airports to look out for her. Put in all the train stations to look out for her. How long is it going to be before someone's like, oh, it's her, and she gets arrested? I thought when you went on the run, you almost always got caught. But I guess I'm wrong about that, because apparently the police are very worried that she'll just disappear into the wind and never be found again. How? It was therefore decided that the police would locate Tyria Moore and simply place her under surveillance. Here was the problem. Once police arrived in Cadiz, they could find no sign of her, so they placed Tyria's parents under surveillance and filed papers with the judge to subpoena their phone records and to monitor their mail, but it would probably take about a week to get clearance. Meanwhile, on December the 31st, Aileen returned to Dick Mills's apartment with a suitcase, smiling brightly and intent on moving back in. She was greeted at the door by Dick's ex-wife, Connie, who had returned to work things out. She said her husband wasn't home. Aileen said that was fine, and she didn't want to wait for him. Aileen never returned. Close call, Dick. That same day, police discovered that some quote-unquote Cammy Green had recently pawned Walter Antonio's golden ring, torn from his dying hand, for a mere $20. Jesus. The year 1991 began with no sign of either Aileen Wuornos or Tyria Moore. Police in Ohio continued to surveil Tyria's family with no luck. Back in Florida, dozens of undercover officers were deployed around the state, quietly searching for Wuornos. 2 of those undercover officers, Mike Joyner and Dick Martin, this story is absolutely full of dicks,
Pun intended?
posed as bikers and went to every bar in Daytona, Eileen's last known location. The officers would only spend a few minutes at each bar, scanning the room for Aileen before moving on. On January the 8th at 9:90 p.m., Joyner and Martin spotted Aileen Wuornos at the Port Orange pub on Ridgewood Avenue, playing pool by herself. Joyner approached Aileen and introduced himself as Drums and Officer Martin and as his friend Bucket. This feels like... yeah, this is Drums, and that's Bucket. It's like, are you guys cops? Are you cops? You sound like cops. It may sound silly and amateurish, but rest assured, Joyner and Martin were veteran undercover cops, and the nicknames Drums and Bucket weren't too absurd for a Florida biker crowd in 1991. Okay, then I take it back. I know nothing about this. It just seems funny. And also David thinks it's absurd too, so don't blame me. Another biker in Daytona at the time was called Cannonball, a fearsome 300-pound, 6'5" giant of a man who was a bartender at the Last Resort. Good lord, that is a big boy. Drums chatted up Aileen while Bucket went outside to radio the rest of the task force that they had found Wuornos. Things were going well until 2 uniformed officers, working from a separate tip about the location of Wuornos, entered the Port Orange pub. No! Bucket and Rust, what was his name? Bucket and Drums are like, dude, no! Or like, let's just arrest her, get her, let's go. It's 4 dudes against her, let's just get her arrested, come on. The uniformed police made a beeline for Aileen and dragged her outside. She fit the description of the woman that they were looking for. All of this like Bucket and Drums undercover, and it's just like 2 cops just walking like, oh, there she is. Just arrest her, just regular walking the beat. Meanwhile, Officer Joyner, aka Drums, was shitting himself. Like with Tyria Moore, police did not yet have enough evidence to safely arrest Aileen on suspicion of murder. Oh, really? Okay, I didn't realize that. The pawned items, the joyride in Peter Seams's car, were all circumstantial. They had no witnesses to the actual killings, no murder weapon, no sign of any stolen items being in Wuornos' possession. Well, arrest her, keep her in jail for a little while, and get those warrants and go looking. Like, go in the storage box and find all those things. Easy. And if Aileen was detained but not charged and then cut loose, the vagrant woman who used fake IDs as frequently as she breathed might disappear forever. Police could also arrest Aileen on the outstanding warrant for Laurie Grody from 1986, but there was some legal ambiguity about whether the cops could question Aileen about the murders if they arrested her for a completely different charge. The fruits of any such interrogation might also get thrown out in court. Outside, the uniform officers asked Aileen to show some ID. She supplied the driver's license of Cammy Green. Officers noted that the picture on the license didn't match. Oh, well done. Someone finally noticed that, huh? To cap it all off, when the officers asked Aileen when she was born, she wasn't able to tell them the date written on the license. Really? How long have you been using this driver's license as a fake ID, and you haven't learned the date of birth? Are you actually kidding me? At this point, Aileen refused to show the officers any other identification and began to get aggressive. Fortunately, the situation did not spiral out of control, with the uniformed officers momentarily retreating to their patrol car to run Cammy Green's license plates through dispatch. Once the officers got on the radio, they were told they were interfering with an undercover operation and to back the hell off. The uniformed officers exited their vehicle, returned the license to Aileen, thanked her, and told her to enjoy her evening. If I was Aileen at that point, I'd be like, what the fuck just happened? It's like, okay, now it's time to go into the wind. Like, that's not paranoid, that's smart. Because you just gave them the fake ID, they're running at your plates, and what was the car? I don't even remember, but it's going to come up dodgy. You just be like, okay, they know, it's time to go. When they know, it's time to go. Aileen re-entered the Port Orange pub, shouting loudly about local police harassment just because she kind of looked like a murderer who was on the loose, and went to the toilets and slammed the door behind her. Her new buddies, Drums and Bucket, waited by the pool table for her. When Aileen re-emerged in the toilet, she started drinking heavily, knocking back can after can of cheap beer. Drums, in particular, lent a sympathetic ear to Eileen's sob story about breaking up with her girlfriend. It was his job to coax Aileen to say something incriminating about the murders, but this was proving difficult. At 10 p.m, Aileen suggested they move to the Last Resort just down Ridrid Avenue. Drums and Bucket agreed. Once at the Last Resort, Drums and Aileen drank and played pool together for a couple of hours, but unbeknownst to Wuornos, Drums would only sip at his can of beer, then go to the restroom, dump it all out, and fill it full of tap water. That way, as Aileen got progressively more shit-faced, Drums stayed sober as an owl. Also unbeknownst to Wuornos, outside the Last Resort, a surveillance van loaded with $90,000 of equipment and 5 undercover cop cars had surrounded the place. Oh, trouble, let's go. Back inside, Drums bought all of Eileen's drinks, and also bought her a pack of cigarettes. By this point, Drums was Eileen's new best friend. She hugged him, laughed at his jokes, and showed him the bullet scar on her belly. Aileen even said Drums was her type. However, at one point, in true Wuornos fashion, her mood suddenly changed. Without warning, she struck Drums across the back with her pool cue. Drums exclaimed, "You fucking idiot, why did you do that?" Aileen replied, "I don't know, honey, it just comes over me." And then her mood became cheerful again. What the fuck? You're full-on sociopath. Like, I don't know, I just felt like beating you with a pool cue. I just felt like it. I just came over me. I just sometimes it does. Sometimes I just like to beat people. Around midnight, a thoroughly plastered Aileen asked Drums if he'd like to go somewhere with her for a good time. Needless to say, Officer Joyner, aka Drums, thought it was a bad idea to get into a vehicle with Aileen Wuornos, lest she hold him at gunpoint and try to rob and murder him. We do not know if Aileen was planning on killing Drums at the time. It could well be that, given he was being generous with his cash, she was hoping for non-fatal companionship akin more to Dick Mills, Donald Willingham, and the other drinking buddies she'd temporarily shacked up with over the years. But Drums got the strong feeling that if he left with Aileen, she'd pull a gun on him in the vehicle and try to make him her 8th victim. Yeah, I mean, bro, not worth the risk, huh? Aileen was completely oblivious to the swarm of cops outside the Last Resort, and once her drunken Aileen pulled out her .22 on the road, anything might happen. In other words, it didn't matter that there were a ton of cops watching them. It seemed like a good way for Drums to get himself shot. Yeah, I mean, a bullet travels real fast. If she pulls a gun on him, she's going to be able to shoot him before the cops arrive. They're like hiding in their cars. Don't get in the car, Drums. Come on. As such, Drums told Wuornos that he and Bucket had somewhere to be, but gave her some money to spend the night in Hawaii Motel just down the road and said he'd see her around. Drums and Bucket then left the Last Resort and reconvened with their colleagues outside. A second team of undercover officers waited at the ready to follow Aileen back to the Hawaii Motel. However, Aileen stayed at the Last Resort until closing at 2 a.m. She was too drunk to walk anywhere, so she staggered from the bar and outside into a sort of shed attached to the side of the Last Resort. She's so drunk, she's like, I can't get down the street. I'm just going to sleep in this shed. That is drunk. It was exposed to the open air, but at least it had a roof. Aileen passed out on an old car seat, which had been dumped on the floor. Little did she know that as she slumbered, a veritable platoon of cops was just outside, remaining watchful throughout the night. On the morning of January the 9th, 1991, Aileen Wuornos woke up on the old car seat of the Last Resort biker bar. This is going to be a bad morning for her. She was hungover. Moving very slowly, Aileen fixed her mussed and oily hair into a crude ponytail, washed herself in the sink in the bar restroom, and put on a change of clothes. She must have been carrying that then. Then, to get through the agony phase of the hangover, she started drinking beer again. By noon, Aileen was comfortably numb and playing pool again. There's nothing like, I understand why people do this because it's like you're feeling super hungover. But if I'm super hungover, the last thing I want to do is have a drink. I'm just like, no. Usually I just have to wait until the afternoon and then you're like, oh, thank God I feel better. It's just time. At 3 p.m., Officer Mike Joyner, aka Drums, and Dick Martin, aka Bucket, walked into the bar and pretended to be surprised and delighted to see Aileen. Bucket was wearing a wire, so the surveillance and tactical teams outside could hear what was going on. Aileen laughingly told him that she'd gotten wasted last night, so she'd slept at the bar, even taking them outside to show them the car seat she'd slept on. Okay. Drums resumed trying to coax Aileen into saying something incriminating. He bought her more drinks. He gave Aileen money for the jukebox, and she put on Digging Up Bones by Randy Travis. When the song finished, she played it again and again and again. Aileen also did this weird thing where she'd go over to the payphone and pretend to make a call. In reality, she never dialed a number. It seemed quite clear that Aileen was not in a very stable state of mind that day. At around 5 p.m, Cannibal, the bartender, told Drums and Bucket that in a few hours there was going to be a party at the Last Resort. This was not going to be a quiet soiree. Literally, hundreds of bikers were going to show up for a pig roast, overcrowding the small bar to bursting and spilling out into the backyard, onto adjoining properties, and onto the streets. This presented the task force with a bit of a problem. Isn't the problem's going to be like Drums and Bucket? They're like pretending to be bikers in a gang or whatever, and all these bikers are going to show up and be like, who the f*** are Drums and Bucket? They had planned to spend a few days just surveilling Aileen, gathering any information they could to secure a conviction. They would not arrest her unless she got violent towards someone. But amid a virtual mosh pit of drunken, sweaty bikers, Aileen could easily disappear, intentionally or unintentionally. Furthermore, if things went sideways, the police did not want to have to storm a building filled with hundreds of drunk bikers. Yes, that wouldn't be good. Joyner, aka Drums, immediately realized this was the case and proposed to Aileen that since she was tired and hungover, that he pay for her to stay at the Hawaii motel for the night. There she could grab a shower and some shut-eye before the party. Aileen asked him why he would do that, suddenly becoming suspicious of this overgenerous stranger. Yeah, it is really weird. Like, Drums said it was no problem and that he'd go to the motel right now and get her a room key. She's not asking why. She's not asking if it's a problem. She's asking why. Why, Drums? This feels very suspicious. You need to have a better excuse. Drums exited the Last Resort and conferred with two other undercover officers outside, saying, quote, "Boys, piss on the fire and call in the dogs because this hunt's over with." They had to arrest Aileen Wuornos now and avoid her slipping away and potentially killing again. Drums went to the motel and rented a room. He returned to the Last Resort and gave Aileen the key. She was in full paranoid mode by this point and went to the payphone, called the Hawaii motel to confirm that Drums did indeed rent a room. When she hung up, duly satisfied nothing was afoot, Aileen announced that she was going to the motel to clean herself up. She told Drums that he should swing by at 7 or 8 p.m. to take her to the party and come alone so they could have a good time beforehand. But Aileen did not leave. She lingered in the bar, continuing to drink. At that point, Drums went outside the front of the Last Resort and leaned on his truck. He called Aileen to come outside and join him for a smoke. She came out the front door smiling at him. Instantly, the cops were on them, manhandling both Aileen and Drums and pushing them against the side of his truck. Aileen was immediately slapped in cuffs. Meanwhile, the cops asked Drums for some identification. Playing along, Drums, aka Officer Joyner, said that he had no identification and immediately got violent and started resisting arrest. He was cuffed and placed alongside Aileen. Oh, that's clever. That's clever. Okay. While Aileen was dragged off to a patrol car, she asked what was going on. The arresting officer, Larry Horzepper, explained that she was being arrested for a failure to appear in court in June of 1986. Would she believe that? That was 5 years ago? This seems like a big operation to get someone who skipped out on theft 5 years ago. Aileen was thrown in the back of the patrol car with Drums. The officers did not climb into the front, but left Aileen and Drums alone in the car. At the time, they hoped Aileen would say something incriminating to Drums in the heat of the moment. "What's going on, girl?" Drums asked. "I don't know what's going on," Aileen snapped. "What do you mean? Why the f*** Talking about a warrant? Trump snapped back. There was a tense pause, and Aileen, suddenly calm and cold as ice, replied, "Honey, you're probably one of these little undercover suckers who's doing some kind of I don't know what's going on." Ooh, smart. Trump's feigned anger at being accused of being a rat. He shouted at Aileen. She shouted back, but she gave up nothing. Eventually, a policeman pulled Trump out of the vehicle, angrily lectured him in front of Aileen for resisting arrest, and then uncuffed him and let him go. Aileen was then carted off to jail. This wasn't a triumph. Police had Aileen Wuornos in custody, but they had no confession, no murder weapon, not even a stray mention of the murders in her conversation with Drums and Bucket. They had banged her up on a failure to appear for a 5-year-old gun charge. Oh, it was a gun charge, okay, not a theft charge. Even if she got convicted of the gun charge, she wouldn't spend much time behind bars for that at all. In fact, at this point, Florida authorities were dangerously close to letting a serial killer slip right through their fingers. Rats and sinking ships. Meanwhile, there was no sign of Tyria Moore. Police began to speculate that maybe Tyria didn't make it to Ohio. Perhaps Aileen had murdered her in early December and the bus ride to Ohio was just a cover. On January the 10th, 1991, the day after Aileen was arrested, police brought in Tyria's father, Jack Moore, for questioning. Undercover agents also approached and interviewed Tyria's stepmother, Mary Ann, brother Jack Jr., and half-sister Tracy at the same time. Down at the station, Jack Moore was calm and polite, but was reluctant to tell police where his daughter was. Eventually, the police convinced Jack Moore to hand over the phone number of the place where his daughter was staying on the condition that Jack would have a chance to call her first. However, once Moore had written down the phone number, police did not honor this request. They didn't want to tip off Tyria and have her go on the run. Police traced the number to a small village of Swyersville in the state of Pennsylvania. They called the number, but found that nobody was home. The Pennsylvania state troopers were duly contacted, who determined which house had the phone number and then went over and forced to surround it. Once the officers were in position, they knocked on the front door and told the occupants to open up. The door was opened by a rather startled Twyla Moore, Tyria's sister, who said that Tyria had gone to the nearby town of Scranton for work. Scranton? Where is this? Pennsylvania? Wait, is that actually where... Scranton, Pennsylvania? That is where the office is set, right? Hey! After learning what motel Tyria was working at, police sped over there and had no great difficulty in spotting her. But police did not arrest Tyria Moore. They had a very weak case against her, even weaker than against Aileen, and Tyria had an alibi for at least one of the murders. And it was becoming abundantly clear to investigators that Aileen Wuornos was the primary, if not the only killer, and as such, the cops asked for Tyria's permission to take her into protective custody. Tyria agreed on the condition that she could only speak to Florida authorities. She was then taken by police to the Victoria Inn, where she was installed in a room. Several items that had previously belonged to the victims were found in her possession. Yeah, but these were gifts to her, right? That evening, Tyria spoke to Major Dan Henry of the Marion County Sheriff's Department, who was one of the Florida police sent up north to hunt for her. She is definitely going to cut a deal, right? She's like, okay, it's deal time. Let's go. I'll testify. Because the police don't have anything, and they need something, and they're going to get it from her, and she's going to get a sweet deal because of it. Henry assured Tyria that she wasn't under arrest, could use the phone, and could leave whenever she liked. Of course, if she had left the hotel, police would have very little choice but to arrest her. Tyria, however, was nervous, compliant, and declared her intention to stay in protective custody. She also repeatedly refused to speak to a lawyer, saying that it would just complicate the situation. No. Not good advice. A lawyer will simplify the situation for you. Always get a lawyer. Lawyer. Regardless of whether Moore had actually partaken in any of the murders, it was clear by this point that she had decided to cut a deal. And you know who will help you cut that deal and make sure the deal is airtight? A lawyer! Come on now! At noon the next day, senior Florida police officers Bruce Munster and Jerry Thompson arrived and interviewed Tyria in a room. Tyria Moore testified that in December 1989, Aileen Wuornos had confessed to murdering Richard Mallory. Moore also testified that she had seen Wuornos in possession of many stolen items and multiple vehicles owned by the victims. In total, Tyria claimed that she was aware of three of the murders, but she did not go to the police because she was scared of Aileen. Tyria Moore did not admit to assisting Wuornos in any of the murders or in concealing of evidence. The interrogating officers would later claim that they believed Tyria Moore's version of events, even though there was no evidence and they had to take Moore on her word. Even if the interrogating officers were more skeptical, the blunt fact was that they didn't have enough to convict Tyria Moore of murder. Yeah, they don't even have enough to convict Aileen, but if they get Tyria to flip on Aileen, then they've got enough for at least one of them. And everyone knows Aileen's the main one. At best, they could charge Tyria with being an accessory after the fact for failing to report a crime, punishable by a maximum of 5 years in prison. Yeah, a maximum? That sounds pretty spurious. Like, an accessory after the fact for failing to report a crime? That doesn't sound like a big boy crime, like murder. right? So get her to flip, get her a deal, and get Aileen in trouble, because she's the one who really needs to be in prison. But in doing so, they would jeopardize the best witness they had against Aileen Wuornos. And as mentioned, the case against Aileen was absolutely extremely shaky, resting mostly on a fingerprint used to sell some stolen items at a pawn shop and a partial palm print of the door handle of a car. And Aileen could easily claim that she had obtained both the car and the items after the victims were murdered. And so, whether out of cynicism or in good faith, Florida authorities quickly dropped the case against Tyria Moore and focused on prosecuting Aileen as the sole killer. They offered more immunity from prosecution if she would not only act as a witness against her ex-girlfriend, but would come back to Florida in order to deceive Wuornos into making incriminating statements or a confession. They arrived in Daytona on January the 12th, and Tyria Moore was taken to the Quality Inn, where she stayed in room 160. A recording device was placed on her phone. Following police instructions, Moore wrote a letter to Aileen, who was still languishing in prison for the 1986 weapons charge. In the letter, Moore claims that her mother had given her the money to return to Florida and collect the rest of her stuff. And it was only after Tyria arrived that she heard Aileen had been arrested. Moore gave Aileen the phone number of her hotel and her room number and asked her to call. Officer Joyner, aka Drums, later joined the team at the Quality Inn, instructed Tyria to, quote, prove to her how scared you are and make Aileen believe it. 2 days later, January the 14th, 3:32 p.m., the phone rang in Tyria's hotel room. Joyner described it as church bells going off, as everybody instantly became alert and snapped to attention. I mean, they'd just been waiting for that, so let's go. Tyria picked up the phone and accepted the charges for a collect call from Aileen Wuornos. This is it, right? Aileen said, "Hey, what you doing?" Tyria answered, "Nothing. What the hell are you doing?" Aileen replied that she was sitting in jail and, quote, "Everything's copacetic. I'm here for carrying a concealed weapon back in 86. Tyria said that couldn't be all there was to it because the police had visited her parents in Ohio to ask about the murders down in Florida. Tyria added that she was getting scared. Oh, Aileen. How are you not putting this all together? I feel like you should have put this together when the police outside the biker bar were like, "Oh no, off you go. Carry on." Aileen told her there was nothing to worry about. She'd read a newspaper and discovered that she wasn't even listed as a suspect. Aileen added, "I'm getting real pissed off. The police accusing us, you know? I'll have a lawsuit out." To further calm Tyria down, Aileen said, "You know the storage? It's over. The storage is gone. I got rid of it, okay?" This was a reference to the storage unit where Aileen and Tyria had stowed their belongings after their breakup. Among these belongings were items looted from the murder victims. Okay, good. I'm glad you got... I mean, I'm not glad, but it's like it's smart criminal behavior to get rid of that because you shouldn't be keeping trophies anyway. What's wrong with you? When Tyria tried to goad Aileen into discussing the details of the murders, Aileen replied, quote, "You know, they listen to everything you say on the phone." Tyria tried to play dumb, and she said she hadn't realized that. Soon after, Aileen said she was going to hang up but would call back soon. Yeah, I mean... Well, Aileen's in prison, so they're definitely recording that call, aren't they? Aileen went to inquire with the prison guard about the rules for Tyria to visit her in prison. Then Aileen returned to the payphone and made another collect call. This time, Aileen's mood had changed. She said, "I gotta ask you something. Is there anybody in that room?" Whoa. Oh, anybody with you in that room? That's intense. We can attribute this to either Aileen's innate sense of paranoia or her cleverness when it came to law enforcement. Either way, Aileen didn't blab. She didn't break. Tyria assured Aileen that there wasn't anyone in the room with her, and Aileen seemed to believe this. Aileen told Tyria that she had decided it wasn't smart for Tyria to visit her in prison. It would only aggravate the police investigation into Tyria and her family. Instead, Aileen said that she would beat the firearms rap, get released, and then the former lovers could reunite. Aileen asked Tyria if she missed her. Tyria said, "Not really." Then Aileen had to go to dinner in the mess hall and hung up. That's not like... Should Tyria be like, "Yeah, I miss you," because she's hoping to cut a deal and get her in lots of trouble? Be like, "Yes, I miss you. Please, my love. Let us reunite, and you can tell me about all of your latest crimes. Describe in detail all of the murders, Aileen." Within half an hour, Aileen was back at the payphone calling for the third time. She asked, "What's the deal with you? Did they talk to you or anything?" "No, not yet," replied Tyria. "But I tell you, I'm waiting. I don't want to get into I don't want my life messed up because of something you did." This was bait. But Aileen was thoroughly aware that the authorities might be listening to her phone calls, so she said, "Well, all I can say is I think it is a case of mistaken identity. You're not going to get in any shit because we didn't do anything." At this point, Tyria begged Aileen to stop lying. They both knew what Aileen had done, but Aileen was too canny for this and merely insisted that she hadn't killed anyone. She hadn't stolen any cars. She'd just been doing a lot of hitchhiking, so of course she'd been seen in a lot of different cars. Aileen wasn't saying this to Tyria. she was performing for whoever was listening. At this point in the conversation, the police realized they weren't getting anywhere and signaled to Tyria to end the call. They'd try again, hopefully, when Aileen would be less vigilant and would let something slip. She hasn't let anything slip. She's not gonna let anything slip. She knows what's up. Tyria told Aileen that she needed to go and buy a beer and told her to call back in half an hour. When Aileen called again, she spoke of how the police might lie to Tyria and say they found fingerprints in order to scare her into making a false confession. Aileen also said that she'd probably have to spend 3 months in jail before her trial for the firearms charge, at which point she might get a few months more time, but far less than a year, and then she'd be free. Once again, the conversation was going nowhere, and Tyria ended the call, saying that she needed to go to McDonald's to get some dinner. Aileen made one more phone call to Tyria at 10 p.m. that night. She asked Tyria if her half-sister Tracy had done anything to the police. Tyria said probably not. Aileen then asked for a second time if someone was in the room with her. Tyria denied this. Aileen then instructed Tyria to enjoy her night and get drunk off some beer and to, quote, have 1 or 10 for me. Aileen blew Tyria a kiss down the phone, which Tyria did not return. The following day, January the 15th, passed with 3 more phone calls where Aileen still gave nothing incriminating away. Increasingly, Aileen turned to expressing her love for Tyria, asking if they could ever get back together. Tyria replied that she didn't think so. Aileen asked if they could at least get back together as roommates, and Tyria said maybe. This feels quite smart. At first I was like, shouldn't you be like, oh, take me back, my love? But that might be too obvious. By playing this kind of like, no, I don't think it's going to work out thing, it makes it seem like she's being played less, right? It's kind of clever. I like it. We obviously can't reproduce every word of their conversations, but suffice to say, the 15th ended much like the previous day, with Aileen signing off on the call, blowing a kiss which was not returned, and telling Tyria that she was, quote, the most beautifulest person I've ever met. It was at this point that Officer Joyner told Tyria that she'd better get serious about extracting an incriminating statement or else her immunity would be null and void, and Tyria would be facing several first-degree murder charges. It's pretty serious motivation, but it's not a fault on Tyria's part. She's doing her job. Just, Aileen she knows that they're listening. She knows that she can't say anything on the phone. Joyner added that Tyria should think about spending the rest of her life in prison the next time she spoke to Aileen because, quote, if there's going to be tears on the next damn phone call, I want them to be real. On January the 16th, at 9 a.m., Aileen phoned one more time. She said hello to Tyria in a friendly and nonchalant kind of way. But Tyria wasn't messing around. With a clear tone of panic that was partially sincere, she said, I don't know what the hell's going on, Lee. They've called me. They've been up to my parents again. They've got my sister now. They're asking questions. I don't know what the hell's going on. Aileen grunted, deep in thought. She paused for a good long while before saying, what are they asking your sister questions for? Tyria immediately blurted out, already in tears, I don't know, Lee. I think they're coming after me. I know they are. Aileen replied in a soothing tone, no, they're not. How do you know that? At this point, Tyria's usually deep voice became girlish and high-pitched as she sniffed continually. They've got to. Why are they asking so many questions then? Aileen said, honey, listen. You know what you got to do, okay? Tyria said, I'm going to have to, because I'm not going to jail for something you did. This isn't fair. My family's a nervous wreck up there. My mum has been calling me all the time. She doesn't know what the hell is going on. Aileen said with a clear tone of resignation, okay, do what you gotta do, okay? All right, I'm not gonna let you go to jail. Tyria said, you evidently don't love me anymore. You don't trust me or anything. You're gonna let me get in trouble for something I didn't do. Aileen replied angrily, Tyria, I said, I'm not. Listen, quit crying and listen. Tyria sobbed. I can't help it. I'm scared shitless. Aileen said, I know. I love you a lot. Tyria then speculated about self-deletion. Aileen interrupted, Ty, listen. Just tell them what you got to, okay? Tyria sniffled and said, what if they don't believe me? Aileen replied, I'll cover for you, because you're innocent. I'm not going to let you go to jail. Then Eileen's voice sank into a whisper, adding, if I have to confess, I will. At that point, the police knew that they were getting close. Tyria moaned through her tears. Why did you do this? Why did you do this? At this point, Aileen burst into tears and whispered, I don't know. But Aileen quickly collected herself and said, listen, Ty, I'm probably never going to see you again. I love you. If I have to confess everything to keep you from getting in trouble, I will. Don't worry, okay? I love you. Tyria did not say she loved her back, and merely said, well, do it now. Get it over with.
No, we'll do it now. Get it over with. Right this very moment? Yes, get it over with. All right. Okay? Okay. You can call me back later. All right. Okay, bye.
And and she abruptly hung up the phone. Without wasting time, Aileen immediately informed prison guards that she'd done something terrible and wanted to talk to someone in authority. Less than an hour after Aileen finished her phone call with Tyria, she marched straight into the warden's office, where she was met by 2 Florida police officers and a public defender. Aileen was read her rights, and then, with a big, dramatic sigh, she sat down and cheerfully announced, "Well, I came here to confess to murder." If Aileen had not voluntarily put her own head in the noose, it is highly possible that the police would not have had enough evidence to convict her beyond a reasonable doubt. In order to protect her ex-lover, she had effectively signed her own death warrant. For all that can be said about Aileen Wuornos, one thing is certain: she loved Tyria Moore. She would later be devastated to discover that Moore had set her up to save her own skin. The selling of a serial killer. Eileen's rambling confession took 3 hours, during which she repeatedly emphasized that Tyria Moore had nothing to do with it. Aileen admitted to murdering all 7 victims, claiming that they had attempted to rape and brutalize her. However, she's a bit light on the specifics, summarizing what happened during all the assaults at once and only giving the general gist of what happened. One of the officers present, Larry Horzepa, reflected, "In my 16 years of law enforcement, anytime I've dealt with a R-word victim or a victim of a violent crime, the first thing that comes to mind is a very descriptive, exact, detailed account of what happened to them, and she never did that in any of these cases." Aileen also told police that she'd thrown the murder weapon, a .22 caliber pistol, into Rose Bay, a small lagoon near Daytona. Police divers retrieved it without difficulty the next day on January 17th. The same day, a press release went out saying that Aileen Wuornos had been charged with the murder of Richard Mallory and that other murder charges were soon to follow. The fact that the police had apprehended the so-called first female serial killer in modern American history sent a shockwave through the nation. It was an overnight sensation, and one that many people had every intention of profiting from. Yes, make that money. I realize the irony of that. The news media descended, offering substantial sums of money to anyone who was willing to give an interview. The local news very sensitively showed pictures of the victims, each accompanied by a gunshot sound effect. Are you having a laugh? Like, the killers. That's what I always say on this show. It's like, the killers. But like, the victims. How about you show a little respect? True crime writers turned up, handing out large sums of money to potential witnesses and working long hours in the race to produce the most definitive and detailed account of what happened within months of Eileen's arrest. A plucky graphic artist made a comic book featuring Eileen's exploits. The San Francisco Symphony Orchestra produced an opera about Eileen's life. And last but not least, representatives for 15 competing Hollywood studios arrived, wanting to release an Aileen Wuornos biopic to the morbidly curious public. Who profits from that? Can she profit from that being in prison? I hope not. In February 1991, 3 officers from the Marion County Sheriff's Office, Sergeant Bruce Munster, Major Dan Henry, and Captain Steve Binniger, began negotiations with CBS and Republic Pictures for a TV movie called Overkill, starring Jean Smart as Aileen Wuornos. Additionally, Tyria Moore was also rumored to have been involved with the movie deal at the time, which led some people to speculate that Moore had turned her ex-lover in order to make some money rather than just keep herself out of jail. Sounds like she's managing to do both, to be honest. Some people even speculated that the police officers had deliberately neglected to investigate Moore's involvement in the murders in order to strike such a deal. That would be extremely corrupt and is that is just speculation. Entirely speculation on David's part, or whoever was speculating that. Allegedly. The allegations against Tyria Moore were never substantiated, but there was a generally sore feeling in the public towards her. She had known about Wuornos' activities and had not gone to the police while the killings continued. And now, commenters alleged, Tyria stood to significantly enrich herself from the deaths of 7 men whom she had done nothing to save. Yes, it does feel rather morally repugnant, doesn't it? In my opinion. Another police officer who had been on the case, Sergeant Brian Jarvis, objected to his colleagues seeking movie deals before Wuornos had even been brought to trial. Sensible man, this Brian Jarvis, isn't he? He alleged that Tyria Moore was not investigated or charged with anything and was given immunity so that she could work with his colleagues in obtaining movie rights. God damn, this is wild. Jarvis, meanwhile, thought that Moore should continue to be investigated and that the Wuornos investigation should not be rushed in order to neatly tie a little bow on the lurid story of a female serial killer. He pointed out that Moore had been picked up with items belonging to murder victims in her possession, and that a witness had seen both her and Aileen Wuornos in the convenience store visited by Dick Humphreys shortly before his murder. As a result of his objections, Jarvis had claimed that his colleagues had been harassing him, leaving anonymous notes threatening his family, and once even breaking into his home to trash his files on Wuornos before Jarvis was suspiciously demoted from homicide back to the Beat Cop Patrol Division. I'm sorry, but f*** this. Jarvis is a legend. Eventually, Jarvis resigned from the police force and began working as a private investigator in Tampa. That's outrageous. This is outrageous. I can't believe this is true. And the vultures continued to circle. At the end of January 1991, a middle-aged man named Arlene Pralley, a born-again Christian who lived with her husband on a 35-acre ranch breeding Tennessee Walker horses, no idea what that type of horse is, saw Aileen Wuornos' picture in the local paper. Pralley claimed that she immediately felt a connection with Aileen and wrote her a letter. If you find yourself, oh man, I feel so close to that serial killer who murdered people in prison. I just feel like we've just got a connection. Maybe, instead of writing her a letter, write a letter to a psychiatrist so you can get treated for something that is evidently wrong with you, in my opinion. Wuornos, who had gravitated increasingly back toward religion during her incarceration, sent her a reply. The two women began a regular correspondence, and they fantasized about living on the horse ranch together once Aileen was acquitted on the murders on the grounds of self-defense. Aileen was sexually attracted to Pralley, who was quite a good-looking woman for her age, and Aileen's flirtations were something that Pralley, married and a supposed Christian, seemed to do nothing to discourage. Their connection was culminated in November 1991 when the 44-year-old Aileen Pralley adopted 35-year-old Aileen Wuornos as her legal daughter. What the fuck are you up to, woman? Pralley claimed that this was because of their deep spiritual connection. Like I say, if you think you've got a deep spiritual connection with someone who's in jail on suspicion of multiple murders, what are you up to? This is mad. Whereas Aileen said it was purely to facilitate Pralley visiting her in prison. From this point forward, Pralley became the sole point of contact for anyone in the news media or the entertainment industry who wished to contact Aileen Wuornos. As it turned out, this was a fairly lucrative position to be in. Maybe Pralley's not so dumb. Maybe this was her plan. It's quite a clever plan. The trial of Aileen Wuornos for the murder of Richard Mallory began on January the 14th, 1992. Aileen's public defender, Trish Jenkins, failed to get the fact that Richard Mallory was convicted of an attempted rape in 1958 admitted into evidence. Jenkins also failed to prevent Aileen's prior criminal record from being read out in court, something that is contrary to Florida protocols. Yes, many hours ago we discussed this. Most pivotal in the Mallory trial was Tyrion Moore testifying for the prosecution. Moore laid the murder of Richard Mallory squarely at the feet of Aileen Wuornos, giving details of Aileen's confession shortly after the murder, the theft of Mallory's car to move them into a new apartment, and Aileen pawning Mallory's personal property. During her testimony, Moore was calm, confident, and sometimes even smiling cheerfully. What are you doing? She did not betray any sign that she was upset to be testifying against her former lover. Aileen Wuornos, meanwhile, looked decidedly more upset when observing Moore speaking in court. Yeah, it's a hell of a betrayal, isn't it? It's that, I mean, you, but also you'll be like, oh, really? You? No! When the recorded phone conversations between Aileen and Tyrion were played, Aileen burst into tears. As part of the trial, Wuornos, who was examined by a team of psychiatrists who found that she scored a 32 on the PCLR test, indicating she was a true blue psychopath and capable of feeling empathy. Jesus. Scored I don't know what that score is. I feel like I want to take that test now. I feel like maybe I've taken that test. I don't think I was a psychopath. Also, that test would be super easy to game because it's like, if you do feel things, it's like really, they're really like, they're not tricky questions if you wanted to game them out of it. Wuornos was also diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder as aggravating factors that psychiatrists pointed toward the horrific physical and sexual abuse that Aileen had suffered as a child, her underage pregnancy, and her teenage years living as a homeless sex worker. Yeah, I mean, yes, her upbringing was, as I said earlier, perhaps the most brutal that we've ever seen on Casual Criminalist, but still, that doesn't mean you can murder 7 people. It's not an excuse. Plenty of people have shitty upbringings, maybe not quite as shitty as yours, and there's also people who have worse upbringings than you. And they don't go on to murder people. They just bottle up all their rage and disorder inside. Or they see therapists forever. That's fine, that's a much better path. On January the 27th, Aileen Wuornos was found guilty of the murder of Richard Mallory. Excellent. On January the 31st, she was sentenced to death. Excellent! Superfluously given a few years for armed robbery. As she left the courtroom, Wuornos called the judge a scumbag. From the gallery, Aileen Prowley looked on piously and sympathetically, not seeming particularly disturbed by the fact that her quote-unquote daughter would not be coming home. After the trial, Prowley convinced Aileen to dump Trish Jenkins as her lawyer and hire Stephen Glazier, who advertises services on local television in Gainesville, Florida, by going by the name Dr. Legal. Dr. Legal, I can imagine is like what's that, catchphrase, catch song, whatever you want to call it. He had handled Prowley's adoption of Aileen a few months earlier. Yes, going through the paperwork of adoption would be the perfect lawyer who can also handle serial killers' murder defense. Aileen had no money to pay Dr. Legal, and so he compensated himself by acting as Aileen's agent and hustling the media for interview fees. That's pretty clever. Prowley also pushed herself forward as a celebrity for having known Aileen Wuornos all of 5 seconds. The Montel Williams Show paid Prowley $10,000 or $21,000 in modern money to come on the show and tell her story. Prowley also received 33% of the profits from a pulp non-fiction book rushed into production called On a Killing Day. In short, Aileen Wuornos, having been betrayed by her ex-lover and finding herself isolated in prison and shunned by the other female inmates, was now being exploited by a couple of low-down two-bit hucksters. They just found a way to... This is kind of wild, right? That's a hustle. Another person that Prowley and Dr. Legal hit up for money was Nick Broomfield, a British documentarian who had arrived in America to do a story on Aileen. Broomfield, for his part, was thoroughly convinced that Aileen Wuornos had killed her alleged R-wordist Richard Mallory in self-defense, and then killed the other 6 men half a year later in a traumatized state of mental illness. Okay, Nick, someone's jumping to the defense. I don't feel that way. In order to interview Aileen, Prowley and Dr. Legal told Broomfield that it would cost $25,000 or roughly $54,000 in today's money. As a sweetener, Prowley promised to tell Broomfield the riveting story of how she had developed a sacred bond with Aileen and how God had miraculously cured Prowley of her mortal injuries after getting kicked in the back by a horse so that she could bring Aileen back to Jesus. Nick Bloomfield's going to be like, oh, wow, that's a crazy lady. She wants $54,000 in modern money, and she thinks that God healed her horse injuries. You'll be like, I won't be paid $54,000. That woman. In reality, of course, the story was no more complicated or exciting than Prowley randomly writing a letter to a murderer that she'd seen in the local paper. Broomfield negotiated Prowley and Dr. Legal down to $10,000 with half paid up front. Prowley and the good doctor took $2,500 of that money for themselves, the other $2,500 being quote-unquote laid aside for Aileen, who was somehow going to spend it all on the commissary while on death row. I mean, yeah, that doesn't sound bad. That's got to be some pretty good money for the commissary. You're going to be like on death row eating all those noodles, making all those phone calls. Right after Broomfield paid the money, Prowley wrote to Aileen in prison saying, quote, she didn't trust Broomfield's eyes. Okay, but he believes you. She just doesn't trust him. That he's like, yeah, the documentary is going to be about her innocence, and then boom, it's about how guilty a sin she is. Prowley then refused to give Broomfield an interview and claimed that she had never received any money from him. Well, you're a good Christian there, aren't you? Even though the exchange via Dr. Legal was captured on camera. Broomfield lost his temper and told Prowley that to her face that she was deceptive and a mercenary, which for a polite upper middle class Englishman like Broomfield, which was the equivalent of him calling her the C word. Yes, it is. You are deceptive and a mercenary. Just call her a cunt. Meanwhile, the irregularities of the Mallory trial proffered an opportunity to move for a mistrial, or at the very least appeal Aileen's death sentence. But that is when, on March 31st, 1992, Dr. Legal shocked many in the Florida legal profession by entering a no-contest plea on behalf of Aileen for the murders of David Spears, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys. Aileen went along with this, claiming that Richard Mallory had R-worded her, but the other men had not. They had only, quote-unquote, started to. Aileen went on to say, I'm sorry that my acts of self-defense have ended up in court like this, but I take full responsibility for my actions. It was them or me. A no-contest plea is effectively a guilty plea, given the defendant has declared they will not fight the charges. And because Aileen had not bartered a plea agreement with the prosecution, she was leaving herself vulnerable to picking up 3 more death sentences. It was a truly bizarre legal decision that, surprise, surprise, called Dr. Legal's competence as an attorney into question. Well, didn't we discuss at the beginning that she wanted to go down? She wanted the death penalty. So it's not Dr. Legal. He has to do what she wants. He was soon ostracized by his fellow defense lawyers, who reportedly turned their backs on him whenever he entered the courthouse. Meanwhile, Dr. Legal's own professional opinion was, quote, "It is the theory and philosophy of Jesus Christ that if you are going to believe that you're saved by Jesus Christ, the first thing you have to do is confess. Confess your sins, and that's between Aileen and God." Mate, why not just say, "I am a lawyer. I have to do what she says." She wanted to confess. She wanted this. I tried. I didn't want this. Do you think I wanted this? It makes me look like a fool. Instead, he's like, "It's Jesus." Behind the scenes, Aileen Prally had also been advising Aileen to quote-unquote get right with God by admitting her sins. After Wuornos pled no contest to 3 of the murders, Prally told the media, quote, "God has forgiven her for what she's done, and our state has the death penalty, so why not go for it? I mean, wow, she could be home with Jesus in a matter of a few years. Look, Prally, if you're so keen on meeting Jesus, well, you know, there's always a way, Prally, isn't there?" Allegedly, in my opinion, you weirdo. According to Aileen, both Prally and Dr. Legal also suggested that pleading no contest and avoiding trial would deprive the police of the information they needed to put the movie Overkill into production. Oh, for fuck's sake. It did not. Aileen also claims that Prally and Legal had both suggested to her that she should kill herself while in prison in order to hasten her meeting with the Lord. What the f*** is going on? Quote, "They both suggested it. It's not very motherly nor very lawyerly, is it? And even giving me some ideas. So that's pretty sick." Yeah, I don't know. Do I believe her, though? I don't know. Probably not. It is unclear what Aileen Wuornos was expected to happen when she pled no contest to 3 murders. Perhaps by doing so, she thought she would earn the mercy of the court and get life sentences instead of the death penalty. How about, instead of that, you negotiate a plea deal, give the police the information, hope that you only stay in prison for the rest of your life and that the death penalty gets taken off the table. That's all you can hope for. Then, all that would be required was to overturn the death penalty that she had received for the murder of Richard Mallory. However, on the 15th of May, 1992, the judge sternly handed down 3 death sentences, along with more superfluous incarceration for armed robbery. Aileen appeared to be shocked before quickly turning to anger. She said, "Thank you, and I'll see ya. I'll be up in heaven while y'all are rotting in hell."
Sentence you to death for the murder of David Spears.
Thank you. And probably see, I'll be up in heaven while y'all are rotting in hell.
You are, well, there's nothing, so you're just going to the oblivion of death. But what made you think you're going to heaven? God has forgiven you. You murdered 7 people. Aileen then leans over to Dr. Legal, who staunchly refused to lift up his eyes from his notes and look at his freshly condemned client. Aileen muttered to him, quote, "I hope you get R-worded in the arse one of these days." Okay. Aileen then said to the judge, May your wife and kids get R-worded right in the arse. I know I was R-worded, and you weren't nothing but a bunch of scum, putting someone who was R-worded to death. Mother. Aileen flipped the judge the middle finger while she was escorted from the courtroom. That evening, she was visited by Dr. Legal, who sang her the folk song, The Iron Lady, the lyrics of which allude in fairly disturbing and detailed terms to a person being killed by the electric chair. That is what is going on. Hey, you're gonna go to the electric... Aren't you supposed to be my lawyer? Dr. Legal, what the f***, man? It seems doubtful that Aileen found this musical performance very comforting. Dr. Legal also planned to film Aileen's execution and to sell the footage off to the highest bidder in order to, quote, publicize the horrors of the chair and also make some money. That wasn't part of the quote. That was my speculation, in my opinion. Aileen Prally could not resist the temptation to write to Aileen in prison, lecturing her for her unchristian outburst in the courtroom. Aileen denied her any further contact, and Prally's gravy train came to an abrupt end. Not long after, Aileen dismissed Dr. Legal and she opted again for a public defender. These 2 pieces of sabotaged Aileen's legal defense for the sake of their own twisted religious views and a few $1,000. Oh no! Bad people getting other bad people in trouble. What a shame. Who cares?
Good God, man. Show some mercy.
Executions a la carte. After it became clear to Aileen that she was going to be put to death, she demanded to be left alone in her cell, waiting for the end to come. Unfortunately, due to the bump it would give them in the polls, every district attorney and judge in Florida wanted a piece of her. She virtually had to be dragged to her remaining trials and the appeals hearings for a growing collection of death sentences, saying to the media, quote, "I'm tired of this re-election jazz. They're just trying to get promotional ladder climbing and political prestige from this, and I'm sick and tired of this. 3 more death row sentences, and I gotta go to Pasco and Dixie for 2 more death row sentences. I mean, how many more times you gotta kill me? You know what I mean? This is bullshit. In June 1992, Aileen pled no contest to the murder of Charles Cascaden, saying in court, "I flatly don't want to be here. I want to go back to prison. I don't care what the sentence is. I'm already on death row. I'm going to see the chair. This is all for re-election purposes. This is not for nothing, but to get you guys re-elected. This is a bunch of bullshit. This doesn't even need to happen. I'm trying to save taxpayers' money. You people don't care. All I want to do is go back to prison, wait for the chair, and get the hell off this planet that's full of evil and your corruption in these courtrooms." Okay, chill. But she's kind of right, isn't she? In a way. She's like, why are you doing this? It's like, look, I plead guilty. Execute me. Whatever. I'm already being executed. If I can just be done with it, please. In November of 1992, for the murder of Charles Cascaden, Aileen was sentenced to death for a 5th time. That same month, the Florida police officers Sergeant Munster and Captain Binninger were transferred out of homicide, and Major Dan Henry resigned from his post for their involvement in discussions over movie deals with Hollywood producers. Good. I'm glad something came from that, to be honest. From this point forward, Aileen became increasingly obsessed with, as she put it, the crooked cops who may have sped along her arrest and conviction in order to make some money. Well, don't become obsessed with it. Just get your lawyer to look into it. And besides, I thought you were done. I thought you were keen to die. Not really, though, are you? Just trying to look hard. No one wants to die, because no one's really sure what's coming afterwards. In the isolation of her cell, she began weaving increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories that extended from the officers in question to the wider branches of the police, prison staff, and the entire Florida judiciary. She also began to lay blame on Tyria Moore for pressuring her to sell sex to strangers on the highway instead of seeing her regulars in order to earn more money. Aileen began to claim, probably correctly, that Tyria Moore had just used her monetarily over the course of their relationship. Nonetheless, Aileen maintained that she still loved Tyria, and always would, but not once in 10 years did Tyria Moore ever visit her in prison. In February 1993, Aileen received her 6th death sentence for the murder of her final known victim, Walter Antonio. She did not receive a 7th death sentence because she was not charged with the murder of 65-year-old missionary Peter Seams, whose body was never found. Despite Aileen's public resignation to her death, the first few years on death row, she focused her energy on Supreme Court appeals, and she tried to enlist a private detective to expose the crooked cops who wanted to sell their movie and the wider conspiracy in the justice system. Aileen's ultimate goal at this point was to get a new trial, where she could more effectively present her case that she had acted in self-defense against Richard Mallory, who had been railroaded by the cops into a confession and had been misled by incompetent counsel into pleading no contest to 5 other murder charges. I thought you wanted that. Isn't that what you wanted, or was Dr. Legal really incompetent? Oh, I don't know.
Oh, yes. I'm a public defender.
There was also the possibility that Florida police officers may have received money from Hollywood studios while the investigation was ongoing, potentially pressuring them into rushing the case against Wuornos to snag a movie deal. Given all these irregularities, there was a solid chance that some or all of Aileen's death sentences could be commuted to life in prison, if not completely overturned. Aileen maintained that she had acted in self-defense in all 7 murders, saying that it didn't matter how improbable it was that she'd acted in defense 7 times. Quote, "It's the principle, not the number. Self-defense is self-defense no matter how many times it is. I don't care if it's 100 times. I never provoked those guys. There was no need for them to look for the closest weapon in the vehicle and try to use it on me to R-word me. 2 did. 5 tried." It's interesting to note here that Aileen changed her story and the number of men who managed to R-word her. She did not say who the second man was. Meanwhile, the consistent changing of her story is somewhat suspicious. It was clear that regardless of trial irregularities and incompetent legal counsel, the state of Florida wanted Aileen Wuornos to die. No judge was going to bear the odium of granting her an appeal on any of the 6 death sentences and jeopardize their re-election. Wuornos was also largely reviled by the public, and so any state governor who signed her death warrant was also likely to get a healthy bump in the polls. And so, on July the 10th, 1996, the Supreme Court of Florida rejected Aileen's appeals for a retrial for the murder of Richard Mallory and the rescinding of her no contest pleas. Aileen's second round of appeals began in 2001 with her lawyers. It takes a long time to kill someone, doesn't it? With her lawyers again arguing that Aileen had received incompetent counsel from Dr. Legal, whom documentarian Nick Broomfield had filmed smoking pot on the quote-unquote 7-joint ride to talk to Aileen in prison. Nick Broomfield, that is a shot you got there, man. Her lawyers also brought in many witnesses to attest to the fact that Aileen had been abused as a child. They brought in psychiatrists to confirm her diagnosis of borderline and antisocial personality disorders, and they attached significance to the fact that Aileen had been heavily intoxicated at the time of the murders. However, By 2001, Aileen had again changed her story. She testified that her previous claims about self-defense were all lies. She said that she had murdered every single one of the victims in order to rob them and leave no witnesses. She said that she had marked the men out for death from the moment they picked her up in their cars. This included Richard Mallory, who Aileen claimed she murdered for his money and for the use of his car to help her and her move Tyria's stuff into their new apartment that morning. Jesus Christ, just rent a car. What? It's clear from her petition to the Florida Supreme Court to drop her appeals that Aileen was playing up her role as a villain. Quote, "I killed those men, robbed them cold as ice, and I'd do it again. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I am so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." Regardless, she's changing her story all the time. Like, oh yeah, no, this, and then that, and then this, and then... No wonder the court doesn't want to hear your appeals, because they'll be like, well, 1 month you're saying this, the next month you're saying something else. Regardless of whether Aileen's new testimony about cold-blooded robbery and murder was true or not, it was clear that Aileen was eager to speed up her execution. She'd had enough. She wanted to die. And the state of Florida was happy to oblige. Aileen's defense team filed a motion that she was no longer mentally competent to make these calls for herself, claiming that her mental health had deteriorated during her years in prison. The appeals process continued for a time, with Aileen deliberately sabotaging the proceedings, shouting out the witnesses who came to testify on her behalf were liars and perjurers. When documentarian Nick Broomfield asked Aileen about her testimony that Richard Mallory had R-worded her and poured rubbing alcohol contained in a Vicine bottle into her various orifices, Aileen said, "Oh, I was just doing a lying biz. That was just my lying gig, trying to beat the system." She seemed amused when Broomfield told her that her story was very convincing, smiling and shaking her head.
Was it? That's sad.
Well, I thought so.
In April 2002, Wuornos started complaining that the female prison guards at Broward Correctional Institution were trying to drive her to suicide by harassing her, shouting insults at her, subjecting her to needless strip searches and cell checks, threatening to R-word her, and spitting and pissing in her food. She wrote a 25-page letter to the Florida Department of Corrections openly accusing the prison guards by name. It's unclear whether these harassment allegations were true, since no disciplinary action was ever taken, or whether they were symptoms of Aileen's growing paranoia. Around the same time, she began to claim that prison officials were trying to control her mind using radio waves. That's the thing, it's a 25-page letter, and she's saying they're pissing in my food, blah, blah, blah. They're also trying to control my brain using radios. They'd be like, okay, never mind. Okay, no, not real. In May 2002, Nick Broomfield visited Aileen in prison once again because she wanted to talk on camera about her childhood. At one point, when Aileen thought the camera wasn't rolling, she told Broomfield that she had murdered Richard Mallory and quote-unquote some others in self-defense. But Aileen said she did not want to have her death sentences commuted to life in prison, since she could not stand being incarcerated anymore and being tortured by the prison staff. To this day, it remains unclear which version of events, self-defense or cold-blooded killer, was the lie. It could be a little bit of both, you know. Sometimes it could have been self-defense. Sometimes she just could have killed people because she wanted their shit. Or is just a psycho. Florida justice. During the spring of 2002, Aileen finally managed to fire her legal team and drop her remaining appeals. This rapidly sped up the pace of Aileen's execution. The appeals process would have brought Aileen several more years, but she wasn't interested. Instead, Florida Governor Jeb Bush signed her death warrant and set the date of her execution for the 9th of October 2002. On 5th of October, a few days before Aileen was due to die, her ex-defense lawyer, Joe Hobson, made a final desperate plea to the governor to not execute Aileen, claiming she was mentally ill and could not possibly make an informed legal decision about dropping her appeals. In response to Hobson's concerns, Jeb Bush gave Aileen a stay of execution while she was examined by a court-appointed panel of 3 psychiatrists. On October the 7th, in under 30 minutes, the psychiatrists determined that Aileen Wuornos was mentally competent enough to be killed. God, that's an intense thing to do as a psychiatrist, isn't it? Because you're like a doctor, do no harm and all that, and you're like, no, she's good. She's competent.
Listen, give me my money, and I will prescribe his blood pressure medication again.
On October the 8th, Aileen gave her last press interview, having selected documentarian Nick Broomfield, for whom she had developed an affinity in the years that he had followed her case. Almost immediately during the interview, it became clear that Aileen had suffered some sort of mental breakdown. She claimed, quote, "The cops knew who I was after Richard Mallory died."
I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up. And let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer.
Oh, yeah, you've lost your mind. Or you're just trying to make people think you've lost your mind. In fact, she didn't leave any fingerprints on Mallory's car. Aileen was actually quite skilled at removing evidence from crime scenes, only leaving a partial palm print on Peter Seams's car in a drunken rush to get away. But at this point, Aileen seemed to genuinely believe that the police had let 6 men die to sell a movie to CBS. Also, during the interview, Aileen claimed that she had been tortured at the Broward Correctional Institution since 1997. They'd used the intercom in her room to transmit quote-unquote sonic pressure that would continually crush her head. She was also being spied on via a camera in a TV or mirror. She wasn't sure which. She also thought there might be a spy computer behind the mirror. According to Aileen, the goal of this torture was to, quote, make it look like I was totally crazy so nobody would believe anything I had to say. It sounds like schizophrenia, doesn't it? Aileen went on to claim that numerous trays of food were given to her, poisoned in an attempt to murder her, so she had to wash poison off in the sink. Aileen said that one day she'd forgotten to wash her food and was sick for 3 weeks and nearly died. Aileen went on to speculate that the afterlife was probably less like Jesus and angels and more like Star Trek, with her being beamed up into a spaceship, which would take her to colonize another planet. Okay. Thus, most curiously, Aileen said, whatever's beyond, I know that it's going to be good, because I didn't do anything as wrong as they said. I did the right thing and saved a lot of people's butts from getting hurt and R-worded and killed too. What? And killed too? No one killed you. When Broomfield tried to ask whether this meant Aileen had killed some or all of her victims in self-defense, she immediately shut down that line of questioning, refusing to talk any more about her cases, saying that nothing was going to stop her execution the next day. Then, after briefly discussing her family, Aileen returned to her original thesis, stating, my only interview concerns are about cops letting me kill. Did you know they were surveilling me before I killed, and that I knew it, and that it was covered up? Did you know that there were helicopters dropping down from the sky, deputy sheriffs with decoys picking me up 4 or 5 months before I arrest? I was covered up. It was covered up. Nick Broomfield pointed out that whether the cops were following her or not, allowing her to kill or not, as she had murdered 7 men, and something inside her must have compelled her to do that. Aileen yelled, oh, you're lost, Nick. I was a hitchhiking hooker, running into trouble. I'd shoot the guy if I ran into trouble, physical trouble. The cops knew it. When the physical trouble came along, let her clean the streets, and then we'll pull her in. That's why. Paranoia. Super paranoia. This was yet another statement that seemed to imply that Aileen had killed in self-defense. When Broomfield asked Aileen why she wouldn't clarify now that she was due to die anyway, Aileen replied that she was doing it out of retaliation for being mistreated all these years. To quote, thanks a lot. I lost my fucking life because of it. Couldn't even get a fair trial. Couldn't even get a fair investigation on nothing. Couldn't even have my pills right. You sabotaged my ass society and the cops and the system. A R-worded woman got executed and was used for books and movies and ladder climbs, re-election, and everything else. I got a big finger in all your faces. Thanks a lot. You're an inhuman bunch of living bastards and you're going to get your asses nuked in the end, and pretty soon it's coming. 2019, Iraq's gonna hit, you know. You're all gonna get nuked, and you don't take human life like that and just sabotage it and rip it apart like Jesus on the cross and say, thanks a lot for the fucking money I made off you. I'm leaving. I'm glad. Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass. Well, good news is Iraq didn't nuke anywhere in 2009, which is that's good news. Broomfield observed that it was incredible that a panel of psychiatrists had judged Aileen sane in just under 30 minutes the day before, adding, it makes you wonder what you'd have to do to fail. That night, likely worried about being poisoned, Aileen declined her traditional choice of last meal and simply asked for a cup of coffee. Why are you worried about being poisoned? Time I'm not worried about food poisoning, enjoying my last meal, because you're going to be dead the next day. At 9:30 a.m. on October the 9th, 2002, she was brought into the execution chamber and strapped down to a table. Aileen declared to the assembled witnesses, many of whom were family members of the victims, I'd just like to say, I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like the movie Independence Day with Jesus. June the 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back. I'll be back.
Stay here. I'll be back.
Sorry I had to do it that way, boys.
At 9:47 a.m., an obviously deranged Aileen Wuornos was killed by lethal injection. She left behind a divided public, unsure whether she was a monster who killed men for a couple $100, or whether she was a mentally ill R-word victim who the justice system had ultimately failed. Lost amid the debate were the families who'd lost their loved ones. For them, the matter was simple. A murderer had gotten the fate she deserved. As Lenny Seams, the son of Eileen's fourth victim, Peter Seams, commented to the media, I just see it as justice being done. Dismembered appendices. Number 1. Aileen Wuornos' official kill count is 7 people, but Cammie Green's testimony implies she was robbing men on the highway as early as 86, and Aileen already had the idea of killing her Johns to, quote, do society a favor. 3 extra years of killing would imply that Aileen only confessed to the murders the police had connected to her from 1989 to 1990. Number 2. Aileen Wuornos is often referred to as America's first serial killer. In reality, Wuornos is only the first modern female serial killer to be classified as such by the FBI. There were female serial killers in the 19th century, like Lavinia Fisher and Jane Toppin. I think we've made videos about both of those. And in the 1980s, Dorothea Puente, who we featured on the Casual Criminalist. Oh, okay, maybe I did biographics videos about them. Operated a few years earlier than Wuornos, is also classified by some authorities as a serial killer. Other profilers exclude Puente and other women who kill sequentially for financial gain. However, this would also exclude Wuornos if one accepts that she killed to eliminate witnesses to her robberies rather than for her personal gratification or out of anger against men who resembled her father. Wuornos herself rejected the title of serial killer and, depending when you asked her, either claimed she was killing in self-defense or out of good old-fashioned highway robbery. Number 3. Most people familiar with Wuornos' case are so because of the 2003 biopic Monster, for which Charlize Theron picked up an Oscar. Wow. This is unfortunate because the script is replete with highly egregious and sometimes deliberate inaccuracies to the point of being hugely disrespectful to the victims. I actually thought it would be fun to watch the movie after I finished researching this episode, and holy I had no idea it would be this bad. Never have I previously seen a movie about a serial killer that was written like an after-school special. Like with the Dahmer episode, I feel duty-bound to set the record straight. I've never seen 2003's Monster. Apparently now I never will. Number 4. Monster presents Wuornos as a misunderstood and downtrodden anti-hero. You are shit me. They retcon her childhood, claiming she started hooking to get her siblings food and money. Her arrest record before the murders is glossed over. Her violent mood swings diminished. Her frequent acts of domestic violence are absent from the film. She's depicted as trying to go straight and get an office job, which never happened. And she's depicted as being coerced into sex by a cop, which never happened. They also significantly reduced the amount of money Wuornos charged for sex to make her seem even more impoverished and desperate. She's depicted as fairly sane, noble, and self-sacrificing as she went to her execution. Oh, I'm glad we set that record straight because that's some bullshit right there. 5. Tyrion Moore is replaced by a character played by the much smaller Christina Ricci called Selby Wall, whose personality is much more meek, timid, and naive than Moore ever was. Oh, okay, so they changed the name so it's so they can't get in trouble, I guess then, right? They renamed the Greens and depicted them as homophobes and racists, neither of which was true. They also do not show the extent to which Wuornos and Moore were violent alcoholics. They have a romantic moment in a skating rink where Aileen gets Selby to come out of the closet, which never happened. They claim that Aileen had never had a relationship with a woman before, which is false, and they seem to imply Aileen and Selby seldom, if ever, have sex. 6. Richard Mallory, credited as Vincent Corey, is depicted as a cartoonishly evil sadist, and the depiction of his murder uncritically follows Eileen's self-defense claims to the letter, Vicine bottle and all, even though we only have Eileen's word for this, and despite the fact that she officially recanted this testimony prior to her execution. Okay, so this is like a fictionalized version, right? It's not actually trying to portray this story, is it? Please don't say they actually called her Aileen Wuornos in the movie. This is not nice. 7. Eileen's second victim, presumably David Spears, credited as Daddy John, is depicted as paying for sex, being a vaguely menacing sleazebag and wanting to get Aileen to call him Daddy in order to prime the audience for it being somewhat okay for him to be murdered. I'm sure the victim's family did not appreciate such an unflattering depiction, especially since there is no evidence he paid Aileen for sex. Number 8. Aileen spares the life of a man credited as Stuttering John because he did not act like a sleazebag. This never happened. Number 9. The murders of Charles Cadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burgess, and Troy Barres are not depicted on screen, but the film later implies that all these men paid for sex. Number 10. Dick Humphreys, credited as Undercover John, is depicted as paying for sex. Prior to his murder, Aileen talks about being R-worded as a child and expresses disgust at Humphreys using sex workers when he is married to soften the severity of her shooting him. Humphreys is killed with his pants off when in reality he was fully clothed. There's no evidence that Humphreys paid for sex. Number 11. The final victim, shown on screen, credited as Horton, is likely Walter Antonio, given that Peter Seams' car was abandoned earlier in the movie and the victim did not drive a sausage truck. Horton is the only man who turns down Eileen's offer of sex. He also offers Aileen charity and a place to stay. Aileen initially tries to get out of the car because the man is being so nice, but at this point in the movie, and unlike in real life, Aileen is desperate for money to leave Florida with Selby and feels she had no choice but to kill him. She is in tears and is super conflicted about shooting him, and afterwards she shows intense remorse. Even in her self-defense testimonies, Aileen never claimed this happened with any victim. Once again, this is fabricated purely to make the audience sympathize with Aileen, despite the fact that she was committing multiple murders. And finally, number 12. We've been here for a while today, haven't we, guys? Monster was written and directed by Patty Jenkins, and it was her first feature film. Her only other film, with credits, are Wonder Woman in 2017, a hit which she directed but did not write, and Wonder Woman in 1984 in 2020. Oh, okay, Wonder Woman 1984 is the title of the film, from 2020. A critical and box office failure, which she both wrote and directed. Jenkins corresponded with Aileen Wuornos while writing Monster, and just days prior to Aileen's execution, Jenkins was given access to a collection of letters between Aileen and her childhood friend Dawn. Jenkins claimed the letters confirmed much of what she'd already written in her script, though it is unclear what letters inspired things like Daddy John or Humphreys getting shot in his underwear. To reiterate, these were based on real people who were the victims of murder. Allegedly based. In 2017, Jenkins came in 7th for Time's Person of the Year. Wowee. Okay. Come on. Okay, that's weird, isn't it? And that's where we end today's video, on that depressing note. Thanks for watching, thanks for being here. It takes a lot to make these big episodes. If you want to do me a favor, leave me a review wherever you get your podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.